All right. Please be seated. Good afternoon. On behalf of organizers, the Scientific Committee, the Applied Macroeconomics and Econometric Centers of the New York Fed, and all the joint sponsors, let me welcome you to the first day of our conference in honor of Guillermo Calvo. Over the next 3 days, we'll have a terrific series of panels, lectures, presentations, all organized around the center theme to celebrate the 45th anniversary of what inarguably is one of the most influential papers in the monetary policy literature of the 20th century. But in fairness, the paper is only a pretext. It's a pretext to celebrate his author and his multidimensional contributions. We'll talk about its continuing impact on the academic macroeconomic literature, and all the academic presentations and discussions will make this abundantly clear. We'll talk about the normative implications in the recent and ongoing policy debate, and we all look forward to the high-level panels and fireside chat. Also, as far as I know, Guillermo is the only macroeconomist after whom both a price adjustment mechanism and a ferry are named. And that in itself would be a great occasion to celebrate him and to have a glass of wine at the end of our day with new friends and colleagues, old and new. So before we start, let me add a personal note. For my generation of economists specializing in international finance and coming of age professionally around at the time of a large-scale crisis of the 90s in Latin America and in Europe, in Southeast Asia, Guillermo's analysis of sudden stops in cross-country capital flows and the effects of exchange rate devaluations were nothing short of a benchmark, not only because they were revelatory in terms of lucidity and analytical depth, but also and foremost because they always put center stage the social losses, the human costs, the devastation and the disruption associated with financial crisis, especially among low-income households and disadvantaged agents unable to insure themselves against unemployment losses and high inflation. This, I believe, is the lasting legacy of Guillermo's contribution and one that keeps resonating across policy institutions, including right here and right now. So, on this note, I cannot think of anyone better than our next speaker to put the exceptional legacy of Guillermo in the appropriate context and explore his evergreen relevance. Mike Woodford is the John Bates Clark Professor of Political Economy and a colleague of Guillermo at Columbia. We have asked him to provide us with a roadmap to Guillermo's body of work. We will reserve the last 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. And Mike, I think, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paolo. It's a really great pleasure to be invited to kick off this conference in honor of Guillermo Calvo. Guillermo was part of the faculty that gave me my first job out of graduate school, and he was a big part of why I wanted to come to Columbia. I've been an admirer of his work for a long time, well before that. I first became aware of him as the author of a beautiful piece of economic theory that was published in the Journal of Economic Theory in 1978. This paper on the indeterminacy of interest rates and wages with perfect foresight. The point of the paper was to show that in infinite horizon economic models, the assumption of perfect foresight, or more generally rational expectations equilibrium, didn't suffice to uniquely determine the evolution of the economy that people should expect. Guillermo presents two examples of economies with overlapping generations of finite-lived households, following the earlier seminal work of Paul Samuelson and Peter Diamond, and he shows that there are conditions under which each model will have not just multiple equilibria, but a continuum of possible equilibria, each of which has the property that if people expect that future evolution, their optimal decisions based on these forecasts will lead market clearing, real interest rates, and wages to evolve in exactly the way that was expected. The idea that perfect foresight equilibrium could sometimes be indeterminate had been recognized already, but mainly in the context of models with fiat money. It was understood that a fiat currency should only have a market value to the extent that it was expected to be valued further in the future. And this made it evident that equilibria with valued fiat money had a bootstrap character that made it not surprising that the equilibrium valuation would often be indeterminate. But this was often presented as a problem specific to models of the demand for fiat money. So it might be thought to represent a problem of failing to promise to make your currency convertible, or it might be thought to be a pathology that only enters because the demand for money hasn't been modeled in the right way in some theoretical model. Guillermo's paper was important because it showed that the problem had nothing to do with money, that the issue of indeterminacy of equilibrium could easily arise in infinite horizon models, even when they were purely real, as here, with only real wages and real interest rates being determined in the model, and even when there were no monetary frictions or other departures from orthodox Walrasian competitive equilibrium being assumed. The finding had an important consequence. It didn't imply, in my view, that the idea of a rational expectations equilibrium was internally incoherent. But it did imply that one couldn't assume that an economy should be in a rational expectations equilibrium at all times, simply on the ground that people ought to be able to understand the economy, to correctly model the relevant economic forces, and hence to deduce what must happen in a rational expectations equilibrium, and then expect exactly that on the basis of their deduction. Guillermo showed that even if everyone were to correctly understand how the economy works, it need not be possible to deduce what the rational expectations equilibrium evolution must be. If there are many possible rational expectations equilibria, then there would be no reason for everyone to be expecting the economy to be in the same one, hence no reason for the economy to evolve according to any of the rational expectations equilibria at all. That doesn't mean that one should never expect an economy to be in a rational expectations equilibrium, or at least in something close to one. But it means that the only time that one should expect that is if the environment, by which I mean both the structure of the economy and the rules by which policy is conducted, have been stable enough for a long enough time for people to have been able to converge to something close to the rational expectations equilibrium beliefs through a process of learning from experience, rather than expecting this to happen through a process of deduction of what the equilibrium has to be. This, in turn, I think has important consequences for the way that we think about policy and about the credibility of policies. If we think that whenever a new policy is announced, however novel it might be, as long as people believe that the policy will really be followed, they should expect the path that represents a rational expectations equilibrium under the policy, then we might think that it should be enough to calculate a policy that would lead to a rational expectations equilibrium that has desirable properties, declare very publicly that this is going to be the policy from then on, and that we really mean it in order to obtain the desirable outcome. If instead we recognize that deduction alone can't be relied upon to get an economy to a rational expectations equilibrium path, even under the assumption that the policy is clearly explained and is believed in, then we should be more careful about announcing dramatic changes in policy. Instead, we will realize that we can be more confident of the effects of policy when policy maintains a great deal of continuity over time, so that people can know how to expect how things are going to unfold based on what they've seen in the past. Another paper that's had a tremendous influence on my own work, and of course on all of the modern literature on the theory of monetary policy, is this one that Paolo was just referring to. I don't think I have to tell you how influential the paper has been, especially for the kind of model-based policy analysis that goes on in central banks, but it may be worth recalling why it was such a landmark. Guillermo's paper contributed to a literature that had developed in the late 1970s that had been initiated by Ned Phelps and John Taylor, who were both colleagues of his at Columbia. This literature pointed out that the 1972 Lucas paper had obtained a strong conclusion about the pointlessness of monetary stabilization policy, not simply by assuming rational expectations, but on the basis of an assumption of rational expectations equilibrium, together with the assumption that wages and prices were determined in instantaneously clearing spot markets. Phelps and Taylor pointed out that one could assume rational expectations, but have wages or prices that weren't constantly adjusted to fit current market conditions and still have a role for monetary stabilization policy. But while Phelps and Taylor established this at the level of general principle, the models they presented to illustrate the idea had weaknesses of two different kinds. On the one hand, the micro-foundations of wage and price setting weren't too clearly worked out. And on the other, the models weren't analytically solvable in a way that provided insight into how they worked, except in special cases that were highly artificial and then couldn't be used for that reason for quantitative analysis. Guillermo's paper was an important step forward on both of those counts. On the one hand, it had much more explicit micro-foundations for the problem of the price-setting firm on those occasions when a firm reconsidered its prices, as well as explicit micro-foundations for the rest of the macro model. And this is an aspect emphasized in its title, where it refers to staggered prices in a utility-maximizing framework. But I think the influence of the paper on the new Keynesian literature is probably due even more to its progress on that second front. The earliest rational expectations models with sticky wages and prices only led to analytically tractable results in relatively simple cases where, for example, wage or price contracts were assumed to last for one period or two periods. These made predictions about the persistence of the effects of policy strongly depended on one's interpretation of what a period corresponds to. And of course, that's an entirely artificial notion. There's in fact no rigid time interval at which all economic decisions are made. So that even if you use a discrete time model, one would like one's quantitative conclusions to be little affected by the choice of period length. John Taylor pioneered the use of staggered contracts that would last for many periods. But this increased the dimension of the model's state space so that then only numerical solutions were possible. Furthermore, with any fixed time length for the contracts, models of those kinds tended to imply dynamics that were not only intractable in closed form, but that involved unrealistic echo effects at the time frequency corresponding to the contract length, because all of the wages or prices that were adjusted at a given point in time, according to the model, were ones that had been set on the basis of conditions at a single, very precise earlier date. Taylor showed that one could get away from this in macroeconometric models by introducing the idea of some non-degenerate distribution of contract lengths. But this made the models even more complex and farther from being able to be understood analytically. It also meant a proliferation of free parameters relative to the available data moments with which to estimate them, leading to possible questions about whether the estimated relationships were truly structural. Guillermo's paper had the advantage of yielding dynamics that were independent of any arbitrary period length. In fact, his paper was formulated in continuous time, even though later DSG models have often used a discrete time version of the Calvo pricing model. His paper also allowed the assumed degree of price flexibility to be continuously varied, all the way from complete flexibility at one extreme to complete rigidity of prices at the others, so that the parameter could be set to be empirically realistic, rather than one having to assume something like prices fixed for exactly two periods purely for the sake of analytical convenience. At the same time, thanks to a clever choice of an exponential distribution of time intervals between price changes, it was a model that aggregated very neatly, allowing the dynamics of the model to be written in terms of a very small state space. This allowed very tractable analysis, and indeed a diagrammatic exposition in this 1983 paper. This has made the setup extremely useful for pedagogical purposes, but not just for pedagogical purposes, also for the construction of fully articulated dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that remain simple enough to be estimated on the basis of a few time series and usually using relatively straightforward econometric methods. This modeling choice was a brilliant one, and I think it illustrates a characteristic strength of Guillermo's work. On the one hand, his work is marked by a deep insight into how the mathematics works that has allowed him to see what kinds of assumptions are just right to allow the kind of highly tractable analysis that provides clear insights into economic mechanisms. But at the same time, there is always a strong sense of what models need to be like in order for an arbitrary formalism not to be driving one to strong conclusions, where the crucial assumptions for driving the results are ones that were purely adopted for convenience and don't correspond to anything that one believes about the world. Being able to find models with both of these features at once requires considerable art, a great deal of insight, and Guillermo has been one of the masters at this. Uses of this model in monetary policy analysis, I think, has had a lot of important implications. One of its implications is it gets a Phillips curve trade-off into a general equilibrium model. Not just a Phillips curve trade-off, but one that depends on expected future inflation. And when I say it involves expected inflation, it's not this kind of expectations augmented Phillips curve that models like the Lucas model or other models in the 1970s or early 1980s had in them. Those were models of a Phillips curve, the location of which depended on expectations in the past of inflation that was expected to occur between some past date and the current point in time. Instead, the Calvo model implies that the short-run Phillips curve trade-off depends on expectations at the time of inflation and output in the short run being determined, expectations of inflation from that date to somewhere into the future. That in turn implies not simply that it's necessary to choose a joint policy across all of the different states that it could occur at a given point in time, but that you have to think about linkages between the policies that are being chosen for successive dates. And this fact that the optimal policy for one date depends on what you're doing with policy at successive dates is one of the reasons why, at least in theory, the models then imply there are advantages of things like price level targeting rules or average inflation targeting, even if the distortions that one is trying to minimize only relate to the instantaneous rate of inflation. And that's a big difference from the conclusions you would draw from models that have a Lucas or Barrow and Gordon type expectations augmented Phillips curve in them. Having a model with staggered price adjustment also implies that there are welfare losses from deviations of the inflation rate from zero, specifically a deviation of the overall inflation rate from the rate at which prices are changing when they're not being re-optimized by the price setters. So it implies welfare losses when the inflation rate deviates from a rate such as zero, and not just from deviations of the inflation rate from whatever rate was expected at an earlier point in time, which is what the Lucas type model of the Phillips curve trade-off would imply. This provides micro-foundations for a policy needing to aim at targeting a low rate of inflation and not simply at ensuring that the inflation rate is predictable at whatever level it has. It's true that the well-known Barrow and Gordon model does assume, it has the other kind of short-run Phillips curve, but it does assume that the policymaker cares about the absolute level of inflation. But that assumption in their model is one that isn't justified by the pricing frictions of the model. It's stuck in as an arbitrary, apparently irrational concern of the policymaker. The Calvo model of price adjustment and generalizations of it instead allow one to develop a welfare theoretic theory of optimal monetary stabilization policy, where the objectives of policy are based on the extent to which people in the model are able to achieve the goals that are motivating their behavior. And in doing that, it allows us to integrate the theory of monetary policy with modern treatments of the theory of public finance more generally. So I've mentioned that the Calvo model of price adjustment has been a highly influential one, and I think it's clear that a lot of that influence relates to how tractable it is, and I think everyone would agree that it is a very tractable model. Some would argue that while it's certainly tractable, other kinds of models of optimizing price setting with sticky prices, such as menu cost models, are more likely to give a correct description of the world because of their supposedly deeper micro-foundations. So it's often asserted that the results of using the Calvo model in monetary policy analysis should be acceptable only to the extent that you think that they represent, the results you get represent some kind of approximation to what would be applied by a menu cost model. And it's often argued that if you can do the hard numerical work of actually solving a DSG model with menu costs, despite the large state space that those models have, you would be on much safer ground. I actually don't think that this is right. The basic menu cost model is actually deeply unrealistic in certain respects that have major implications for the analysis of monetary policy. The canonical model assumes that all price setters are constantly aware at all points in time of exactly what the optimal price for their product would be under current market conditions, and also of exactly how much they lose from continuing with their existing price. Thus, prices are assumed to adjust if and only if it's currently worth paying the menu cost in order to change them. This prediction is inconsistent with a lot of observations about individual prices. We see both too many very small price changes, for which it shouldn't be worth paying the fixed cost, and also at the same time, too many very large price changes, such that it would seem that prices have been allowed to become more misaligned than should have been necessary in order to justify paying the fixed cost. Actual distributions of individual price changes tend to be leptokurtotic, as the Calvo model would in fact predict, whereas the basic menu cost model would predict a distribution of price changes with two spikes in it. A group of price increases, all of similar size, and another group of price decreases, also all of similar size, at exactly the two sizes that are associated with adjusting your prices exactly when it first becomes worth paying the menu cost to do that. This difference in the predicted price adjustments under the two models also matters quite a lot for conclusions about the effects of monetary policy. Because the menu cost model with full information and perfect optimization implies that each price is adjusted exactly when it becomes worthwhile to do it, it becomes possible for the distribution of relative prices in the economy, and hence the real distortions resulting from misalignment of prices, to remain roughly invariant despite fluctuations in the rate of growth of nominal spending. The consequence is that such models predict relatively small real effects of erratic variation in nominal spending, and hence small real effects of monetary shocks. The Calvo model instead implies much larger real effects of monetary shocks, because the prices that increase in the case of a burst of nominal spending are not always precisely those prices in the economy that were previously farthest below the currently optimal level of prices for that supplier. How, though, should one interpret the apparent constraint on what would otherwise be optimizing behavior that's introduced in Guillermo's paper? In my view, it should be interpreted as an attentional constraint. It would actually be costly for price setters to have to constantly monitor market conditions and constantly recalculate their optimal price, even though in most weeks they would then decide not to make any change. Instead, firms economize on these cognitive and informational costs by only intermittently bothering to recalculate their prices. And they can only save these costs by not constantly calculating whether it's currently the ideal moment for them to reconsider their price. One can in fact develop a model of state-dependent pricing in which the timing of price revisions is endogenized as the solution to an optimization problem, but is subject to an attentional cost of the kind postulated in Chris Sims's theory of rational inattention. I've shown how to do this in a paper published in the Journal of Monetary Economics in 2009. In that model, there's a standard new Keynesian model with Dixit-Stiglitz monopolistic competition. Labor is the variable factor of production. The model is simplified like a lot of simple new Keynesian models by assuming perfectly flexible wages, although prices are not being constantly adjusted. Firms only intermittently reconsider their price because they pay a fixed cost of information collection and decision-making on the occasions when they do reconsider whether their current price is optimal. It's assumed that if they pay that cost, though, they collect sufficient information to then be able to set the optimal price given economic conditions at the time of that reconsideration. The decision about when to reconsider the price of the firm and so pay this cost is optimized using a model of rational inattention, which means that a stochastic policy is adopted by the firm that maximizes expected profits minus an information cost term, which has a positive parameter theta, indexing the cost of information, times I, a measure of the amount of information about current conditions that are being used in the decision whether to reconsider the price or not. One can work out then what the optimal probability over any small unit of time is of the firm reconsidering its price, which turns out to be a function of market conditions. In a simple case that I analyze in the paper, it turns out that this function is only a function of one state variable, a normalized price index indicating the percentage amount by which the firm's current price is out of line with what would currently maximize profits. And this shows what that optimal hazard function, that function of the instantaneous probability of reconsidering your price, as a function of this normalized price. The Q on the horizontal axis is by what percent your current price is above or below what would be currently profit maximizing. And this shows what that optimal probability of adjusting as a function of price misalignment is like for different values of the theta, that information cost parameter. In the limit, as the theta is made equal to 0, the model becomes one where this hazard function becomes a square well. Between those two vertical lines, there's 0 probability of adjusting your price. Anywhere outside the two vertical lines, there's 100% probability of immediately adjusting your price. That's the prediction of the standard menu cost model or standard state-dependent pricing model, or sometimes called SS model. Of price adjustment after the names of the two thresholds at which prices get adjusted. If you make the information cost positive, what the figure shows is if theta is a small positive number, like the magenta dashed line, you then get a curved surface. You don't get the exact square well, but it still looks a lot like the square well. The probability is still very close to 0 at most of the points between the two vertical lines, and it rises pretty rapidly up to being close to 100% of instantaneous probability of adjustment if you're very far outside the two vertical lines. As you make the information cost bigger, however, this becomes a flatter and flatter relationship. I want to draw your attention to the green curve labeled theta equals 5, since I conclude that that's the most empirically realistic parameterization of the model. And you get the prediction that this hazard rate is quite flat everywhere from the leftmost of the two vertical lines all the way over to the right of the figure. However, to the left, which means your price is too low to be profit maximizing and too low to a greater and greater extent, you have the green curve rising fairly steeply up to a much higher probability of adjusting your price if prices are too low. If you made the information costs even higher, larger values of theta make this hazard function flatter and flatter. In the limit, as the theta is made unboundedly large, it becomes this horizontal black line, a constant hazard rate independent of current economic conditions. That's, of course, Guillermo's model, that extreme case of the hazard rate independent of current economic conditions. One gets a result like that out of this kind of rational inattention model as a limiting case. One can ask what the most realistic parameterization then is and how much a realistic case is similar to or different from the much simpler model that Guillermo had proposed. So in the paper, what I do is I propose to choose parameters for the model to match microdata both on average time between price changes and the average size of price changes. Those are things that you can get by appropriately parameterizing what the cost is of holding one of these meetings where you reconsider your price, and also parameterizing the size of the innovations in the random walk that's determining nominal spending. But then I also require that the model be parameterized to match the kurtosis of the distribution of individual price changes in microdata as studied in particular by Virgilio Midrigan. This then allows the information cost parameter, the value of that theta, also to be pinned down. What I find is that the value of theta needed to match the kurtosis of the distribution of individual price changes is that it should be around 5. Much lower values of theta imply much too little kurtosis. Higher values imply significantly too much kurtosis, so it needs to be something on that order. What does that imply about then the real effects of monetary disturbances? This is showing in the calibrated model what the impulse responses of the log of real activity in the economy are to a one standard deviation positive disturbance to this random walk in nominal spending. The model is calibrated the same way for each of these curves, but they correspond to different values of theta. You see down at the lower left the theta equals 0 case, the pure menu cost model, and there's very little immediate impact on real activity of the monetary disturbance, and what effect there is disappears within 2 or 3 months. So it's small and it's also not at all persistent. That's the kind of result that Golosov and Lucas get in their calibrated DSG model with a standard menu cost model. If one has a higher value of theta, the effects are both bigger and more persistent. The Calvo model is the case shown by that dash-dotted red line, where you have a particularly strong real effect and also a relatively persistent one. But the magenta line just below it is the theta equals 5 case that I argued was actually the empirically realistic parameterization. And what you see there is that when you use the rational inattention model with that calibration, it gives you almost the same size of impact effect of the nominal disturbance on real activity as the simple Calvo model, and almost as much persistence, not quite as much persistence, but as a first pass, simply using the Calvo model to predict the effect of the nominal disturbance doesn't get you too far off quantitatively. Using the basic menu cost model would instead have been very misleading about what the effects of nominal disturbances are. Of course, another extremely important paper of Guillermo's, and the occasion for our conference is this one, published in Econometrica in 1978. As Paolo was saying back at the beginning of our session, this is one of the key references in the development of what was surely one of the biggest ideas in macroeconomics in the latter part of the 20th century. That was the recognition that if people's expectations are endogenously shaped by the predictable character of government policy, then conventional optimal control approaches to the design of an optimal policy are invalid. The problem with applying Bellman's principle of optimality to the choice of an optimal policy reaction function is that it would lead the optimizing policymaker to choose actions that don't continue the plans that were the basis for their own previous calculations of optimal policy, giving rise to the time inconsistency that's in the title of Guillermo's paper. This might seem like only a technical issue relating to the correct way to calculate optimal policies using theoretical models, but it has profound implications for one's entire way of thinking about policy and monetary policy frameworks in particular. If one thinks of stabilization policy as a standard optimal control problem, then it follows that the main constraints on how close one can get to the theoretical optimum in practice are how good a predictive model of the economy's dynamics one has and how skilled the policymakers are at using it to predict the consequences of alternative policies and judging which of the possible forward paths is actually the best one. One then focuses on trying to have as much information as possible about the complex situation one is in at any point in time. One focuses on developing accurate forecasting capacity and putting people in charge who have been good forecasters, whether they use models that they can explain to other people or not. And one places great importance on putting the best possible people in charge and then giving them considerable discretion to exercise their finely honed judgment about whatever situation has arisen. One doesn't think that it's important to be able to communicate in advance about what one is likely to be doing later. Indeed, it would be easy to argue that it should always be unwise to commit to anything before seeing what situation one turns out to be in. The papers of Kydland and Prescott in 1977 and Guillermo's 1978 paper here instead imply that a purely discretionary approach to policy can lead to very suboptimal outcomes, and even when the discretionary policy is being calculated using a model that's precisely correct, the state of the economy is recognized with total precision at all times, and optimal policy is correctly calculated using a correct loss function to evaluate alternative outcomes. Instead, they show that there are, at least in principle, large potential gains from commitment in advance to constraints on policy that it's desirable for people to be able to count on. This idea has had important practical consequences, especially for thinking about monetary policy. Probably the most important of those, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the role of this argument in the debates that went on for several decades in the latter part of the 20th century, eventually leading central banks around the world to accept the desirability of having explicit inflation targets. But another, maybe less well-known implication of this same kind of argument, it's actually been crucial for understanding how central banks can respond in a deep crisis in which interest rate policy is constrained by an effective lower bound on short-term interest rate policy. The same kind of argument that I've been talking about the advantages of advanced commitment over discretionary policy, are what create a role for forward guidance about how policy will be conducted after the effective lower bound ceases to bind, and this has in turn been a big issue for the way monetary policy has been conducted over the last couple of decades. As Paul Krugman first noted in an important paper back in 1998, a crisis of this kind can be made worse by people's expectation that the central bank's usual low inflation target is going to be pursued again immediately as soon as the effective lower bound is no longer preventing that from happening. And he argued that the effects of the crisis can in fact be mitigated by a credible commitment to temporary overshooting. A particularly useful way of doing that would be through a commitment to allow overshooting to get the economy back on a price level target path that it would have been on in the absence of the crisis, something that was argued in a paper of mine with Goidy Egertson. Here in the Federal Reserve System, Chicago Fed President Charlie Evans has talked a lot about that, such as in this speech in 2010 that I mention here. Now, you might ask, how can the same argument be providing the important intellectual support, both for arguing for the importance of guaranteeing that an inflation target is going to be taken seriously, also for the importance of assuring people sometimes that it won't be allowed to constrain policy too tightly? And I think it's important to realize that the argument for the desirability of the inflation target is in fact not an argument that it's always better for inflation to be low, but rather an argument that policy needs to internalize the effects on previous decisions of what was then predictable about later policy. Often, the most important effects of those kinds, effects on previous decisions of predictable later policy, are negative effects of people's anticipating higher inflation later. A well-known example is the possibility of anticipation of higher inflation leading to an adverse shift in the Phillips curve trade-off. That's what Kydland and Prescott were emphasizing in the discussion of monetary policy in their paper. Another such effect is effects of anticipating higher inflation on reduced willingness to hold nominal assets, increasing monetary frictions and reducing the seigniorage tax base. That was the basis of the argument in Guillermo's paper that I was just referring to. Both of those well-known effects are cases where the anticipation effects that you should worry about are negative effects of anticipating higher inflation. But when the effect of lower bound binds, the most important effects of anticipated future policy are instead of a different kind. They become the effects of anticipated future policy on aggregate demand, and here the expectation effects cut in the opposite direction. It's anticipation of too much tightness of policy later that reduces aggregate demand during the crisis period that becomes the biggest distortion that a discretionary policymaker is going to be expected not to internalize. And so the kind of departure from discretionary policy that can actually improve things is if predictably there will be some allowance of temporary reflation following one of those episodes. Now, a question about this, I want to jump to the second bullet point here about the rational expectation analysis of what can be gained from those kind of policies at the effect of lower bound. Many people have asked whether the effects of commitments about future policy are really as strong as the well-known rational expectations equilibrium analysis. So this implies, here at the New York Fed, Marco Del Negro and co-authors had a very influential paper a decade ago about what they called the forward guidance puzzle, arguing on empirical grounds that one didn't seem to see anticipation effects that were quantitatively as strong as the rational expectations analyses implied. And I think this raises an important point. A lot of the literature in analyzing questions of this kind analyzes optimal policy, taking into account anticipation effects by computing the best possible rational expectations equilibrium under the assumption of perfect commitment, and then supposes that the best policy is to commit to and announce the forward path of policy required for that equilibrium. But it might not be realistic to suppose that one can actually achieve the outcome predicted by that equilibrium because of the difficulty of getting people to expect exactly that path simply by announcing that you're committed to it. Even if people believe that the policy will be followed, at least in the near term, and even if they understand what its near-term consequences should be, changing their expectations about the farther future may be much harder. Here again, I think Guillermo had a lot to teach us. It's actually been a big theme of a lot of his work, that it's dangerous to assume too strong a form of perfect credibility when one is analyzing the consequences of endogenous expectations. One example of one of his papers that had a big influence on me is this one from a conference volume published in 1993. It was before that an IMF working paper on exchange rate stabilization policies, where he argues for the importance of assuming imperfect credibility. So in this paper, the authors discuss exchange rate-based stabilizations in several South American countries in the 1980s and point out that what happened was not exactly like what a theoretical model would predict using the rational expectations equilibrium analysis under the assumption that the exchange rate peg would be permanently maintained. They propose instead an analysis in which the peg is imperfectly credible. People expect that a reversion to more inflationary policy can occur at some later date, even though they do expect the new policy to be maintained for a time. This is an analysis in which the announcement of a dramatic new policy has effects that occur at least partly through an effect on endogenous expectations. But expectations are assumed not to fully reflect what should happen in the rational expectations equilibrium if the policy change is permanent and its consequences for the entire future evolution of the economy are correctly understood. Guillermo and Carlos present their analysis as one in which people may be viewed as still having rational expectations. It might simply be reasonable to doubt whether policy will be changed as much in the long run as they understand and as it's being announced to being changed in the near term. But I think that another possible view of what they're doing in this paper is that they're trying to back off from the strong predictions of rational expectations equilibrium analysis that can be obtained when one assumes that simply announcing a new policy that's intended to apply even far into the future should lead people to change their expectations, even about the distant future, on the basis of confidence in their ability to calculate the new rational expectations equilibrium path, even far into the future. And in fact, I think it's wise to want to back off from the full implications of rational expectations equilibrium analysis in this way. The question that leaves us with is how to develop an approach to policy analysis that doesn't completely ignore the effects of policy announcements on expectations, especially on expectations about the relatively near term, where the implications of the new announcement are likely to be clearest without going all the way to assuming that people are able to deduce complete new forward paths for the economy arbitrarily far into the future. I've taken a stab at doing this myself in some recent work with Yin-Chi Shea at the Bank of Canada. Just to indicate very briefly what that work is like, we consider a model in which people are able to do forward planning some distance into the future, but only a small distance into the future. And then they have to assess how well they like the situation they can imagine getting to through some series of actions, a finite distance into the future, using a value function to analyze the terminal dates that they might have got to. The value function, in turn, is something that has to have been learned inductively from past experience. The consequence of using this model of boundedly rational decision-making is that one can assume that when the policy regime has been stable over time, people should learn a value function that's reasonably useful for evaluating different situations that they can find themselves in. And the outcome of the exercise with finite horizon planning will in that case be similar to what the rational expectations equilibrium analysis would tell you. The question is what happens if a dramatically new policy is announced that doesn't correspond much to people's previous experience. And the answer to what happens then, at least in our analysis, is that people should take into account their understanding of the new policy in that forward planning exercise that they carry a few quarters or maybe even a couple of years into the future. It should not, however, change the value function that they're using to analyze the positions that they can get to after that. So it ends up being the case that we have an analysis which generalizes the idea of rational expectations analysis, having people take into account the effects of the policy announcement maybe a few years into the future, but not having assumptions about how they're assessing where they would be further in the future on the assumption that policy has in fact changed very much, or at least that outcomes for the economy have changed very much further in the future. I think it has a lot of the flavor of what Guillermo and Carlos were doing in this paper. We apply that model, among other things, to analyzing what would happen using forward guidance when the effective lower bound is binding. What do you conclude from that? One thing you can conclude is, well, forward guidance becomes weaker if people are only planning maybe a couple of years into the future in their explicit forward planning exercises. On the other hand, it doesn't become completely pointless, and we show that policy can still be improved upon using forward guidance. We show that there are still advantages of price level targeting regimes over purely forward-looking inflation targeting. On the other hand, there are also some important new ideas that come out of thinking that people are doing this kind of finite horizon planning. One is that there becomes an important difference between simply introducing a temporary price level target on an ad hoc basis when you find yourself facing an unusual shock. Under the rational expectations equilibrium analysis, you might think you can get just as good a response to that shock from announcing as a one-time basis that you're going to deviate from your normal policy following this shock and then go back to standard inflation targeting once you get back on the price level path. If you instead assume that people are boundedly rational in the way that Yin-Chi and I propose, then there is a difference between doing that and having a price level targeting regime or an average inflation targeting regime all the time. And this is that if you had the alternative regime all the time, people should learn a different value function. And then when the crisis occurs, the effects you can get from policy are better because people have a value function that leads them to have more desirable expectations in the event that that situation arises. Another thing that's different is that from the full rational expectations analysis is that I think that thinking that people are not able to simply compute correctly the complete forward path for the economy once they understand the policy announcement, it means that it makes central bank communication more important than the rational expectations analysis would imply. telling people about how the central bank sees things unfolding can also help pin down what the expectations are that they have about the future. I think that's likely to be particularly important if you do something like introducing an average inflation targeting regime, where people may not understand well themselves exactly how the averaging is supposed to be being done. Talking them through very specific scenarios and how the central bank would see things unfolding may make it clearer what kind of expectations people should have to have. So let me jump ahead to try to sum up here. I would say the role of expectations, and more specifically the fact that they can be influenced by what central banks and governments announce about their intentions, makes the conduct of monetary policy a good bit more complex. I've only touched on some of the ways, but I think it's clear that there are a lot of new complexities that come in. Guillermo's work, I think, remains very highly relevant to us even now, because throughout his career, he's really focused to a great extent on exactly those complexities, both on the complexities arising from the logical structure of rational expectations equilibrium analysis, but also complexities arising from plausible cognitive frictions and uncertainties that complicate people's ability to have exactly correct or exactly model consistent expectations. I think in his degree of focus on these complexities, he's really been a model for all of us, and I think his work is going to continue to be a very important guide for the work that people in central banks in particular are doing for quite some time to come. Thanks. So if Paolo allows me a few minutes, then we can have a few questions. If not, there are more interesting things coming soon.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Trish Mosser. I am a director of a master's degree program in economic policy management at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. My predecessor running that program for more than 10 years was Guillermo Calvo. And I also run the school's initiative on central banking and financial policy. I also spent quite a few years working in this building right here. So it's nice to see friends and former colleagues from that time too. I'm really pleased to moderate this kickoff panel in this wonderful conference. I don't know anybody who deserves this more than Guillermo does. The topic, monetary tightening, inflation, and debt sustainability. It's a big one. It's appropriately big, given light of Guillermo's contributions, both in the academic research sphere and in the policy world as well. But time is really short. We only have an hour, and that's a massive topic. So I'll get going. I'm going to keep the introductions very short. Kicking off will be Rich Clarida, the C. Lowell Harris Professor of Economics and Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and of course, just incidentally, the former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve. Second will be Francesco Giavazzi, professor at Bocconi, and until recently, a senior advisor to Italian President Mario Draghi. And last and certainly not least is Pierre-Olivier Gurnshaw. Currently, he is serving as the IMF's Director of Research, and in his other life is the S.K. Angela Chang Professor of Global Management at Berkeley. So I think, Rich, the floor is yours. You've got 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, I think I will use the podium out of force of habit, but I don't have slides. So how about that? Well, I'm truly humbled to be included on this 3-day program honoring Guillermo Calvo, a towering figure in the field of international monetary economics, a respected policymaker and trusted advisor to institutions and governments around the world, and for the last number of years, my good friend and colleague at Columbia University. In fact, it could be said I would not be at Columbia but for Guillermo. When he and Maury Obstfeld decamped to Penn in 1986, it left a huge hole in the graduate macro teaching matrix at Columbia, and Ron Finley thought I could help to plug it, and I've been at Columbia ever since, so thank you, Guillermo. In my remaining minutes, I'd like to offer some reflections on the topic of this panel, monetary tightening, inflation, and debt sustainability, based on observations drawing on 3 prominent episodes of monetary fiscal dynamics from the 1980s, the 2000s, and then currently. The common denominator in all 3 episodes I hope to illustrate is that discussions and debates on fiscal monetary policy interactions have often in real time missed the big picture that only with hindsight becomes obvious enough so as to become a new conventional wisdom on monetary fiscal dynamics ahead of a future episode when this theme is tested again. So I'll begin by drawing from the 1980s experience featuring the Reagan tax cuts and the Volcker disinflation. If you read, or as in my case, remember, the contemporaneous commentary and what passed for informed discussion of this episode, you will be struck, I believe, by how closely and narrowly it used to a rather narrow closed economy analysis that ignored capital flows, the exchange rate, and the idea of a policy mix that could and did push in different directions. Now, of course, Volcker got his disinflation, Reagan got his defense buildup and tax cuts, and foreign investors got their treasury securities and Rockefeller Center. But of course, today, any serious analysis of monetary and fiscal interactions begins with an open economy framework, much of which was developed by Guillermo over decades by himself and co-authors. But that was decidedly not the case in Washington and most of U.S. academia 40 years ago. And I was a young staffer at the CEA during some of that time, so I do remember it well. Now, fast forward to the 2000s, and I believe we see this, what was then the new conventional wisdom at work in the early years of the euro. We have many folks, including my panelists, who are far more expert than I, but allow me to offer this interpretation. A very independent ECB set monetary policy, taking fiscal policy, or really in those days, 17 fiscal policies as given, while the hard work of fiscal union was left unfinished, or perhaps it might have been thought at the time even unnecessary. There was a Stability and Growth Pact on the books, but it was widely ignored, even eventually by the Germans. Now, for the first decade or so, this system appeared to function passably well. The ECB got the inflation rate it wanted, and for example, the Greeks got the fiscal policy they wanted, and German investors got the Greek government bonds that they wanted, until they didn't. Now, I have neither the time nor the expertise of my fellow panelists or audience members to go into detail on the Eurozone crisis, but certainly in hindsight, it was not Eurozone monetary policy or the price stability mandate that was compromised. It was the Eurozone fiscal regime that had to and over time changed. My third and final example, unlike the first two, cannot benefit from hindsight because it is still playing out today. But surely we know enough today to say that while Washington may have gotten the pandemic and post-pandemic fiscal policy it wanted, the Fed so far has not gotten the inflation rate that it wants or wanted. Now, there are different interpretations of this reality. The fiscal dominance view of this ongoing episode is both elegant and self-contained. Given the huge increase in government debt issued to pay for $6 trillion of pandemic and post-pandemic deficit finance fiscal policy, the Fed simply can't get the inflation rate at once. According to this theory, it gets the inflation rate that the fiscal theory of the price level dictates that it must to clear the Treasury market. An alternative view, which I share, is that the Fed and U.S. fiscal policy clearly ex post got aggregate supply wrong, especially the post-pandemic labor market. As a consequence, monetary and fiscal policy in place by the summer of 2021 was supporting a trajectory for aggregate demand that in the event was way too hot relative to post-pandemic supply. Under this view, eventually, like Volcker, the Powell Fed will get the inflation rate at once. But unlike 40 years ago, the gross federal debt to GDP ratio is not less than 50% of GDP, as it was at the end of the 1980s. It's 130% of GDP and rising. And because of QE1, QE2, QE3, and QE4, I was there for that one, the Fed holds a lot of this debt. What are the implications of this? Well, there are many, but I will highlight one. This episode demonstrates definitively that QE is not, nor was it ever, printing money. QE in an interest on reserve regime is printing T-bill substitutes. QE does not change the quantity of debt. It does not monetize debt. It changes the maturity structure of debt. If in ex-ante terms, whether this adds to or relieves or reduces the total sum of interest payments on a fixed quantity of debt will depend on the ex-ante term premium. If the ex-ante term premium is positive, then QE over time will lower the cumulative value of interest cost by definition. If, as may be the case in the U.S., the ex-ante term premium is negative, then QE will raise the cumulative value of interest cost. But regardless of the sign, QE is not printing money. It is changing the maturity structure of a given quantity of government debt as determined by the fiscal authority. Milton Friedman is right. There is no free lunch. Instead, the cost is paid in terms of either higher interest rate payments or higher price level or both if the QE program is accompanied by a fiscal policy that generated excess demand relative to available aggregate supply. Now, in closing, much or all of what I've said will be neither novel nor noteworthy to this esteemed audience. But these points are not widely understood or appreciated outside of the circle of folks attending a conference like this. So thank you for allowing me to share them with you in preparation for sharing them more broadly. Thank you.
Just, please.
So I think that the only reason why I have the honor of being here to discuss Guillermo's career is because we both come from countries that have been characterized for a long time from fiscal dominance. And what I want to do today is to walk you through a case study of the interactions between inflation and fiscal policy based on the recent experience of Italy, very recent, the experience of the Draghi government for the past 2 years, which instead, surprisingly to my view, are not determined by fiscal dominance, but an active use of fiscal policy to try to mitigate the effect of an inflation shock on the economy. So this is the starting point, is inflation in the Eurozone and in the US. The difference, at least in the way I look at this picture, is that there are two differences. One, that inflation started later, in this episode of inflation started later in Europe than in the US, because in Europe, the inflation shock was mostly the effect of an increase in energy prices, which in Europe means gas prices, since most of the energy, with the exception of France, comes from gas, and gas imported mostly from Russia. So if you look in particular at core inflation, which is the dotted blue line, it really starts at the date of the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. So what was how was this addressed? What the Draghi government tried to do is to address this in two ways. First, tried to use fiscal policy to address the effect of inflation earlier than after the effect of inflation have an effect on the economy. So earlier rather than later. And how did this happen? I think in three ways. One way was to reduce the effect of the shock, and the way the effect of the shock was reduced was by rapidly diversifying gas supplies away from Russia towards Northern Africa, and this happened in a matter of a couple of months. Second, by sheltering the economy, so using fiscal policy to shelter the economy from the shock, and third, by trying to act directly on the shock through a cap on gas prices. So this picture looks at the use of fiscal policy to shelter the economy. This looks only at Italy, only in 22. So Italy spent about 3% of GDP trying to shelter households, firms from the shock. And the idea was to shelter them ahead of the shock, of the effect of the shock being materialized, rather than afterwards. In the case of households, it was mostly through fiscal support for keeping the price of gas down through subsidies. Same in the case of energy-intensive firms, and for both household and firms through lower indirect taxes on energy and lower excise duties. How was this gives you the distribution, how was this financed? I don't think Italy was the only country. This was mostly financed by taxing the extra profits that energy companies that were selling, for example, hydroelectric power at the higher gas-determined energy prices were making. So in 22, almost one by one, the increase in the cost for protecting household and firms came from this extra tax on energy producers. How was it used? So where's the shelter element? It was, in the case of households, it was used to reduce the effect on inflation on household budget. So this gives you the distribution of the effect of the inflation shock on households by deciles of expenditure. And you see that in the lower decile, in the first decile, the shock would have had an effect of 10.4% of expenditure. This has been reduced to 1.3, and then lower on, moving to higher deciles. Overall, the shock would have had an effect of about 7%, 6.9. It was reduced to 3.7, 7 in part through tariff mitigation, that is by subsidizing tariffs, and in part directly through transfers. This also had effect on, obviously, on distribution, both on the risk of poverty, which went down because of the concentration of the transfer on low-income households, and of course on the Gini coefficient. Did the strategy work? It's difficult to say. In 2021 is a year where it is difficult to evaluate what happened, because Italy was coming out of a big hole, the hole of the pandemic shock of 2020. Growth was 6.7%, higher than had been forecasted, but a lot of that growth can be attributed to coming out in the hole. What is more interesting is 22, because Italy, by the end of 21, had reached the level of demand, the pre-COVID level of demand, and therefore estimates of growth were between 2 and 3%, and growth was essentially 4%. And I think that part came largely because of the protection of budget of households. What was the effect on debt and debt sustainability? The deficit, of course, increased as a result of the transfers and the subsidies to tariffs, but because the economy was growing much faster than expected, the debt to GDP, after having jumped from 134, that's the number before the pandemic, to 154, so having gone up about 20 points, fell in 21-22 by about 10% of GDP, not going back to the level of 29, but going back. So that was the second element. The third element, and we go back to inflation, was a fight the Draghi government had with other members of the European Union and with Germany in particular. We thought that you should think of the main supplier of gas to Europe as a monopolist, because Russia produces a lot of gas. This gas can be only sent to customers via pipelines. Pipelines are not fast to build. Russia is building a new big pipeline to China. It will take maybe 5-6 years before gas can flow through that. Russia also does not have plans to liquefy gas and therefore export liquefied gas. So the only alternative to putting gas in the pipeline and sending it to Europe, which is the only place where the pipeline go, is to burn it in the sky. And we all have memories of pictures of Russian gas being burned on the border between Russia and Finland. So what comes to your mind that the obvious way to do this is to put a cap on gas prices. Gas prices were 20 euro per mega, whatever the unit is, mega kilowatt per hour, 20 before the war. They went all the way up, as this picture shows, to 350 in the summer of last year, and then they fell at the beginning, mostly because of mild weather in the fall, but the fall in gas prices accelerated when finally the European Union was convinced to put a EU-wide cap to the price of gas, not at 20, which was the pre-war level, but at somewhere around 80. So this is I try to walk you through this. What is the lesson from this? I think the lesson is where I started from at the beginning, that there are ways to use fiscal policy to dampen the effect of in this case, of a price shock on the economy, and then to the extent that the dampening works, this avoids fiscal dominance or debt rising. Now, of course, you can tell me that this is too early to tell, but this is what happened. I'll stop here. Pierre-Olivier.
Yeah.
Great.
So thank you for having me on this panel. It's also a great honor to be here and to honor Guillermo. I can think of 2 points of contact between my work, both my current work and my research work, and Guillermo. So first, obviously, there is the IMF. Guillermo was a senior advisor for a number of years in the research department at the IMF, and as some of the papers that have been presented by Mike earlier today, some of them were actually written at the fund while Guillermo was at the fund, and I can tell you that that work is very present. It's very relevant to us every day when we think about stabilization, when we think about credibility, we think about monetary policy and fiscal policy interactions. So that really is a legacy that really endures, and we're trying to build on. My second point of contact is more personal. I never overlapped with Guillermo. We were never in the same institutions at the same time. But there is a very strong point of continuity between us, and that's Maury Obsfeld. Maury was a colleague of Guillermo for many years, and he has been a colleague of mine for 20 years, also with a strong connection to the fund. And through Maury, I think I have absorbed over the years a number of the sort of important papers and important messages from Guillermo's work. So it's really an honor to be here today. Now, what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is I want first to offer a few remarks from a global perspective on inflation and what we see at the fund when we're looking at inflation somewhat globally. And then I'll zoom in and maybe offer 3 different, I call them policy vignettes, I think are illustrative of the kind of work that Guillermo has done and are relevant for us right now. Now, I won't talk about the European Union or the euro area. Francesco did this actually as well as Rich, but I will talk about a few other countries that have been, in our view, in interesting places recently. So first on inflation, I'm going to say things that I think most of you already know very, very well, but let me just briefly go through them. So key observation is inflation is a global phenomenon. It's something that you can see on the left is hitting all countries in the world. Maybe the only exception you have on this figure on the left is China, where we haven't had much inflation yet. The figure shows you sequential headline inflation, so this is 3 months annualized. It gives you a sense of sort of the higher frequency movements. Of course, there's more noise if you do it that way, but you can see when things turn around. And you do see the surge in headline inflation to levels in advanced economies we haven't seen since the great inflation of the 1970s. You also see the turnaround in headline inflation starting sort of later in 2022 and continuing into this year. So there's been a little bit of the good news if you look at headline inflation. The news is not nearly as good when you look at core inflation that excludes energy and food prices. Again, the middle figure is showing you for a bunch of regions and countries, the US, the euro area, advanced economies outside of the US and the euro area, and EMs, except a few that are sort of having their own little problems. And you can see there that when you look at core inflation, there is no sense that core inflation has really turned the corner. I mean, there have been a few prints that have been sort of coming down, and when you look at the U.S. or maybe some other advanced economies, but by and large still extremely elevated, not nearly coming down as much as we've had for headline inflation. The third graph on the right is showing you what we see when we look at wages. And we've done a study back in October in our World Economic Outlook where we looked at wage price spirals over time and trying to sort of see if, when we look at previous episodes where you have a rapid increase in nominal prices followed by an increase in nominal wages, whether that leads to some persistence in this process of wages catching up after prices, et cetera. And we found relatively little evidence of that. That was sort of reassuring. That's what you see in sort of in the blue line here on that chart on the right. Is sort of the median path for real wages in event a time where zero is sort of when we start the wage price spiral clock, and you do see sort of real wages decreasing a little bit before and then increasing back after that, but and coming back towards something that is closer to productivity growth. So no evidence necessarily that you get this sort of wage prices going on, and we have supplementary graphs looking at nominal wages and nominal price inflation, and they also confirm that things sort of tend to come down. But what is interesting in the current episode is what we are seeing when we look at real wages. That's the yellow line you see there. We've had wages that really haven't increased very much when you compare that to the price inflation we've had. So mechanically, real wages have been coming down a lot, and they are down very significantly outside what we've had in previous episodes. Now, you can look at this two ways, and we're not exactly sure how this will play out. One is that, well, this wage moderation is kind of a good sign. It means that somehow this will moderate, or this has moderated already price inflation. You can look also at it looking forward and say, well, there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand on nominal wages to try to catch up going forward. We have in many countries very tight labor markets. It's hard to see how there isn't going to be some form of catch-up in real wages, meaning nominal wages rising faster than inflation. And then what that implies for future price dynamics is something that we are not quite sure about. Now, we've had the previous panelists, and especially Rich, has talked a little bit about the sources of inflation that we've seen on this figure. And our analysis here, I won't sort of take too much time getting into this, is that it's a combination of both the supply disruptions we had during the COVID pandemic, coupled with extreme levels of supports in many countries, many advanced economies, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. Now, one analogy that I found useful when thinking about this is that we can compare it, and others have explored it as well, is we can compare it to what happened in other situations of war financing. The war was against the virus. We had to pay people to stay home. In the actual war, you'd pay people to send them to the trenches and fight actual fights. Here, we send people to stay home. But there is an imbalance between nominal spending that goes on and the actual production that takes place in a situation like this. That leads to an adjustment in price levels after, in a sense, the fight is over. And we've seen some of that, just like we've seen it in previous episodes of war financing, whether we think about the Second World War. And so that adjustment in levels is helping both on clearing adjusting the balance sheets, clearing some of the surplus that has been accumulated on the private sector balance sheets, and is helping to restore the public sector balance sheet, reducing the liabilities. And that's also something that is aligned with what Francesco was showing in terms of the reduction in debt to GDP in a country like Italy, for instance, in the last year and a half. So I think that's an interesting perspective when thinking about what we're going to see eventually in terms of price and wage adjustment. Now, of course, the other thing that's going on is in response to this global inflation problem, we've seen a global tightening of monetary policy. This is the figure on the left. Most countries have been moving into tightening territory. The exceptions, again, are Japan and China. But with different degrees, and we've had much more tightening, for instance, in the US, where in blue here you see some estimate of the real rate as the nominal policy rate minus the 3-year ahead CPI inflation back in 2021 Q4, that's the blue bars, and then in red you see the same estimates as of last quarter. And so we moved from very negative ex-ante real rates in 2021 to sizably positive real rates in the US. The same is true if you look at advanced economies outside the US and the euro area. The same is even stronger if you look at emerging market economies. A lot of them have tightened monetary policy very aggressively. That is less the case if you look at the euro area. Now, some of it may be for reasons that Francesco's emphasized, that the nature of the inflation process there is also tied to maybe more to the energy shock, especially in 2022, and this is creating its own dynamics, but there has been much less tightening there. Third, on the right, this is creating 2022 is creating a big response in bilateral dollar policy, dollar exchange rates. You see there the appreciation of the dollar that we've seen through the course of the year There's been a slight reversal since November 1st when inflation numbers have eased in the US, and as a result, markets have interpreted that there will be a softening of the policy path in the US. As a result, the dollar has depreciated a bit, but the black dots here are showing you the bilateral movements in the exchange rates, and with the exception of maybe Mexico and Brazil and Peru, there have been substantial appreciations, and that creates also tensions on the fiscal side. It creates tensions in these countries also on the inflation side, because with dollar pricing, that translates often very quickly into imported price inflation. Okay, so let me move on to my three little vignettes here. And I will look at three countries where I think we have interesting tension between what needs to happen on the monetary policy side, what's happening on the fiscal side, and maybe on the financial stability side. And this space where you have tension between maybe potentially monetary policy, fiscal policy, and financial stability is, of course, a space where credibility and institutions and reputations do matter, and that's at the core of Guillermo's work. So my first policy vignette is about what happened in the UK around the fallout from the mini budget in last fall. So here, as most of us will remember, we had, following the announcement of this mini budget back in September, announcement that included fairly substantial unfunded tax cuts in an environment in which you had elevated inflation. There was a concern about both the sustainability of public finances. There was a concern about how the Bank of England was going to respond to that. And on top of that, you had all the financial stability issues related to, as the gilt prices started falling, then the liability-driven investment funds tied to the pension sector that started having to post increasing margins and found themselves in serious difficulty. And as a result of this, fairly quickly what you had is a very rapidly depreciated pound, a collapsing sterling prices, so increasing yields, and the Bank of England that stepped in and intervened to actually offer some backstop for the LDIs. And in doing so, created a lot of incomprehension in the market, so couldn't quite figure out whether the Bank of England was still on a tightening path, but at the same time expanding and offering liquidity to these instruments, and what this all meant in terms of both monetary, fiscal, and financial dominance. And that episode of very elevated uncertainty was finally resolved when you had first a U-turn on the fiscal side that was actually very critical, coupled with a very firm insistence by the Bank of England that it would intervene in the markets but on a very temporary basis just to address the illiquidity pockets and not anything more than that. And you can see that once these measures were taken, then the yields started abating and the sterling, the exchange rate recovered. Even though there were some traces of that episode were left, in particular in the mortgage markets where mortgage rates remained elevated beyond that. So the policies in the UK, by and large, in terms of our own assessments, are on the right track, but the lessons from this episode is very clear. When you have to have this change in direction in monetary policy, and you can have difficulties in interpreting what is going to be happening, both on the fiscal, monetary, and financial stability front. And that's where communication, credibility, and really strong institutions is really important. And even in a country with the strong institutions that the UK has, this can generate elevated instability and financial instability in the short run. The second policy vignette is more forward-looking, perhaps, but I want to sort of spend a minute talking about Japan and the conduct of monetary policy, and in particular the yield curve control that has been in place for some time and has also led to some volatility of late in the markets. And so here, since 2016, the Bank of Japan has implemented a policy of yield curve control where it sets both the short-term policy rate at negative 0.1%, and it also has a target for the 10-year rate, and it implements the target by intervening on the bond market and purchasing government bonds at these maturities or around these maturities. And now this policy was designed to provide a clear signal of the Bank of Japan's commitment to a very accommodating monetary policy through that period while providing some stability on the yields. Now, with the rest of the world, as I showed you on the previous slide, the rest of the world moving into tightening territory, and in particular, the Fed starting to tighten, it has been increasingly difficult, and the conditions have worsened in Japan. You've had, the Bank of Japan has had to intervene more aggressively in order to defend the yield curve control policy by buying more aggressively at the 10-year tenor and even at the 5-year tenor. To give you an idea, they're holding right now, the Bank of Japan is holding about 78% of the outstanding 10-year government bonds at the 10-year mark. So you see that on the left where you see the purchases in the yellow bars, and that starts increasing very markedly after the Fed starts tightening in January in the beginning of the new year. In December of last year, the Bank of Japan relaxed a little bit the ceiling on its YCC policy, increased the ceiling on the 10-year bonds from 25 basis point to 50 basis point. But that created also a situation where markets became more uncertain and started to test that new upper limit at the 50 basis points. Now, why is this important here? Well, it's important because Japan potentially, and movements in yields in Japan that would be intermediated through the global financial institutions with a global footprint potentially can affect markets far and wide. What I'm showing you on the right is an estimate of the size of Japanese investments in the different markets that you have there. So, of course, if you look at a country like the US, that's about 3% of the local market. When you're looking at bonds, and a little bit more when you're looking at equities. Bond is probably the one that we would be focusing more on here, but it can be much higher in some other European countries like France, for instance, where it's above 4%, or Australia, where it's around 6%. So major repricing in the Japanese bond market through the impact it may have on these financial institutions and financial intermediaries can translate and potentially affect the functioning of bond markets more broadly. Now, our assessment, and the Japanese authorities, the Bank of Japan, have maintained their YCC policy so far, and our assessment is that this is appropriate given that there isn't really yet very strong inflation pressures that are building that would necessarily require them from tightening their policy. But in thinking about that potential transition that might happen at some point in the future, this is clearly one of the difficulties that they will have to navigate, and managing both maintaining a monetary path while ensuring financial stability is going to be complicated. Third vignette, and with that, of course, conference in honor of Guillermo cannot avoid mentioning Argentina. So my last slide is about Argentina, and here what I want to mention is the fact that of course, yes, we can start talking about monetary policy, but when it's Argentina, very quickly we have to pivot to fiscal policy. There's just no two way around it, and I'm showing you on the left the change in the central bank's balance sheet. In particular, on the left, you have the change in sort of base money. And then you have the three lighter blue bars are sort of change in reserves. The middle bar is financing for the government. And the last bar is sterilization paper that is issued by the central bank. So you can think of this as sort of the counterparts of the change in the base money. And when you had periods of closed capital account, as Argentina had between 2010 and 2015, or more recently since 2019, what you have is situations where you can have basically monetary financing of the government. That's like the middle light blue bar that you see there. It can be financed in different ways. Back then, it was financed by the accumulation of reserves that the central bank had. In the middle here, you see that it has been financed in part by issuing central bank securities that are now accounting, as of November 2022, or accounting for about 8% of GDP in Argentina. But the important point is that even if you look at the intervening period between 2016 and 2019, when the capital account was open, you still had a fairly elevated inflation process there. And why you had this fairly elevated inflation process is for reasons that are very, very well described in Guillermo's work. There was not through direct financing of the government by the central bank, but it was by the increased borrowing on external markets that eventually led to the expectation that the currency would depreciate and eventually would lead to some inflating away of the debt, as we've seen happening in the country. So here, in the case of Argentina, we see the absolute direct implications of a situation of fiscal dominance that has been occurring for many decades. It doesn't matter your exchange rate regime, it doesn't matter what else you're doing, it doesn't matter what other reforms you have in place. If you have a form of fiscal dominance that is in place, then that's going to basically drive your inflation process. And Argentina is, of course, a program country. We're working closely with the authorities right now in trying to sort of gradually restore price signals and monetary signals and gradually tighten the fiscal targets so that we can move away from a situation of fiscal dominance as much as possible. So conclusion, as I've tried to illustrate with these 3 little vignettes here, the kind of issues that we're dealing with every day at the fund, the kind of graphs I'm looking at when I go in meetings and I'm talking to my teams, these are the sort of issues that are very, very directly related to Guillermo's work. So it's really, present every day. Thank you.
So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask one question, and then we'll open it up. I'm looking here at Paolo. Is that okay? Okay. And I want to start with financial markets, because financial markets, at least, seem pretty convinced that central bank policy rates are, A, not going to go much higher, and that policy rates and inflation, for that matter, are going to come down fairly quickly in the not incredibly distant future. In other words, there's not any sign of bond market vigilantes yet, at least. Even the central banks themselves are expecting a pretty quick slowdown in core inflation. But frankly, history tells us that underlying inflation, particularly in advanced economies, is sticky. It doesn't come down that fast if you look back a bit in history. So my question is to the panel is, what happens if central banks do have to go higher, significantly higher, or pick your case, central bank policy rates have to stay higher for longer because inflation is slow to come down? And the real question here is, doesn't that make debt sustainability, fiscal dominance a problem for many more countries perhaps than, it's clear Rich already thinks it's a problem for the United States, but it strikes me that that's a scenario where we might have even more debt sustainability problems in a much bigger part of the world, much broader parts of the world.
I guess I want to clarify. I don't think fiscal dominance is, I think the Powell Fed will get the inflation rate at once. The amount of heavy lifting they have to do is a function of the amount of fiscal support that we got. But if fiscal dominance means fiscal theory of the price level, so the Fed's an afterthought. No, Powell will get the inflation rate he wants. The question is, to the earlier part of your question, at what level of rates? I'll just offer one empirical fact that I take some comfort in. The last 2 recessions, for a variety of reasons, have been very severe and in some ways unusual. So if you go back to a less chaotic recession, 2001 or 1990 in the U.S., both of those were MBER recessions. In each case, GDP growth in the calendar year of the recession was positive. In each case, the unemployment rate during the recession rose about 1.25 points. And in both of those cases, wage inflation fell pretty promptly. It fell by about 1 point. And so I am a nominal rigidity macroeconomist. I think there is inertial inflation, in large part because Calvo's work. And wage inflation is clearly in excess of that, consistent with the Fed's inflation target. We've already seen a step down in wage inflation in the U.S. with an unemployment rate at a 50-year low. So I think part of what's happened in the U.S., and I remember talking to the Fed staff about this in 21, is that what shows up in the official data as wage inflation is a huge once-in-a-50-year change in the relative wage structure of the economy, and as it's playing out. But I think part of the diminution in wage inflation we've seen the last year with a very tight labor market is some of that relative price adjustment is is easing off. So I guess I would answer part of your question at least that way.
Francesca.
Yeah, I think we should start from observation that inflation has as I said before, a very different origin in the US and in Europe. In Europe, demand never went beyond the level of demand before COVID, 2019. So inflation is essentially driven by this huge energy price shock. And my view is that if gas prices, because the energy price shock in Europe means gas prices, goes down, and it has been falling in the last few months like a rock, then inflation can go back to the pre-shock level. Now, of course, if you leave inflation in the system long enough, it will work itself through. That's why I think it has been a very big mistake to delay by about 8 months the price on gas prices. Had we introduced the price of gas prices in the spring of 2022, then I think inflation would have jumped, but would come down fast. Now it has been in the system for 10 months, and it's longer to kick out. But the origin is very different. That's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I think you're saying inflation is sticky, and so it might take longer. I think central banks are already taking that into account to a large extent. I mean, and in the projections that we're seeing, for instance, it's very clear whether you look at the US or other countries, there is an expectation that, for instance, the unemployment rate is going to be rising over 2023 and into 2024. So there's going to be a cooling effect that monetary policy is going to have, and inflation is not going to be coming down just on its own. It's going to be coming down also because of the actions that central banks have been taking. There's been an interesting disconnect between what the markets believe and what central banks have been trying to communicate on the path going forward. And markets have had a tendency of late to overreact to any piece of good news and sort of expect, somehow the game is over and we can all go home, et cetera. And it's just not the case. So there is a sense in which perhaps this might complicate the formulation of monetary policy for authorities, because if financial conditions ease too much because markets become too optimistic about what might be happening, then that means there isn't as much tightening in the system as the central banks want in the first place. So there's some discussion around that. Now, in terms of the implications, the fiscal implications, the implications for debt, and I think we have to think about debt service in particular. Here, I think we have to realize we start from a situation where debt service has decreased tremendously over the years, even with the increased COVID debt and with the increase in public debt we've had in many countries, because interest rates have been so low and coming down for a long time. So even with the increase we have over the last year or so, in advanced economies, there isn't really much of an increase in debt service compared to historical levels. Another reason is, for many countries, debt is, there's a number of maturities, just like prices can be staggered and wages can be staggered. Well, debt maturities are also staggered. And so the full impact of an increase in rates that we see now is going to work its way. It's going to take a while. So it's not something that's going to hit many countries immediately. Where we do see the impact of the current monetary tightening is not so much through there is some increase in rates, but it's in the emerging market and frontier economies, low-income countries. And they're hit because there is a risk premium that comes with the tightening of financial conditions. So the spreads are increasing very, very quickly. Then they get hit on the currency side because every dollar-denominated debt or euro-denominated debt is becoming that much more expensive. So we do have an increase in the number of countries that are facing situations of debt distress. It's a large number of countries, it's a large number of people, it's not a large share of the world GDP, so it's not systemic in that sense.
So, thank you. That was the point I was interested in getting to, is that financial conditions on average are shockingly not tight. That's my personal opinion. In most of the advanced economies, they're much tighter in certain places. Anything having to do with real estate finance, as your picture showed, and in emerging markets. So it's the pain is sort of oddly distributed. It seems at the moment. Anyway, thank you. Okay, questions. everybody else. Please.
My question is for Pierre-Olivier, who was very critical about comms. So the Bank of England made clear that the intervention back in the fall was temporary, and it was a financial stability intervention, not a monetary policy one, aimed at short-circuiting any spillovers to the rest of the financial system. And it was completely unwound since, so it's, the episode is over. Other than making those two concrete points, how else would you have communicated the intervention to make it more successful, if that's what you're...
It's a good question, but I want to clarify, I was not critical of the bank. I mean, I think the bank did an incredible job in a very, very difficult situation. And you're absolutely right that the bank immediately said, we're intervening in this pocket of the market, the indexed gilts, we are going to be purchasing. And so we're going to be doing this for financial stability reasons, and it's temporary. But in a situation where you have this increased levels of uncertainty, especially coming from what's happening on the fiscal side, what's happening on the financial stability side, it can be hard for markets to read. Even if you are very, very clear in your communication, it can be hard for the markets to really hear what is being said. And I think it took until there was really the turnaround on the fiscal side and the reaffirmation by the Bank of England that this would be temporary, that in that dramatic way could say that the purchases would end on that Friday, and it would then move over to a sort of liquidity facility to really sort of have the markets turn over on this. Now, I'm not sure what could have been done better. This is a sense in which I'm not critical at all about what the bank has been doing over that period. It was incredibly tense, I'm sure, from the ground situation. But when you have a situation where there can be a challenge to what is perceived as the path for monetary tightening, despite what is being said, you have all these other shocks going on, you can understand why markets might be very, very nervous.
No questions. Right here.
Thank you. A question for really all of the panelists. As was shown nicely in one of the slides, real wages in many economies declined very substantially in this inflation period. And it might be reasonable to anticipate, indeed most models would suggest that over time there would be some recovery of this. So when central banks and others are assessing an appropriate versus an inappropriate path for wages going forward, how are we to distinguish between what is some reasonable restoration of wages relative to productivity and output versus excessive wage growth? And how patient should we be to allow a period in which workers recover a little bit of that lost wage, potentially at the expense, for instance, of profits and capital? Thank you.
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think initial conditions are very relevant here. If the initial conditions were ones that did not feature 400 or 500 basis point overshoot on inflation several years in a row, I think there might be a different reaction. I take Powell and the Fed speak literally. I think they're concerned about second round effects, but I don't think they'll have a lot of patience for another 2 or 3 year overshoot because it's wages catching up, and I think that's a critical feature of this dynamic. I'm encouraged by the fact that you've had a big downshift, and Christian, you and I have discussed this. We've had a big downshift in nominal wages, which to me is with a very low unemployment rate, which to me is consistent with the relative wage dynamics having sort of played out. But this is all a theory. Going forward, I think a potential risk in the outlook is, we get some good news on inflation, goods prices fall, rental inflation comes down, and so the top line numbers might look very good. But if behind the scenes, wage growth is 4.5%, I think, Houston still has a problem. So I think that's the way they'll see it too.
I can say a few things. So first, if you go back to this analogy I was using of war financing, and if you think that we're going back to the labor market we had pre-pandemic, and forget about productivity growth for the time being, suppose that we don't have any productivity growth, then you could imagine that we need to go back to the same real wage, that this is going to be the real wage that clears the labor market. And so if nominal wage growth has been lagging price inflation, then it could be a period during which we have higher nominal wage inflation than prices as we recover the lost ground. And this doesn't necessarily translate into ongoing inflation, but doesn't necessarily is, hope more than a policy. Because then you start looking more closely, and then you realize that what I just described is a sort of very aggregate perspective, but then you look across industries, you look across firms, and it becomes a statement about margins. Margins have increased early on,
Yeah.
and the question is, can margins come back down, and we end up at the same place we started from? Well, for some firms, yes. For some firms, no. For some sectors, yes. For some sectors, no. And that's when you can get this inflation dynamics getting underway. But we're also not going back to the pre-pandemic labor market. We know that there are some pretty profound changes that have happened in the labor market. One of the reasons we have this very, very tight labor market right now is there's been a reduction in the labor supply. And some of this reduction in labor supply is still a legacy of the pandemic. It's older workers not re-entering the labor force. It's people with dependent care and things like that. And so we have had a reduction in labor supply. We also have one other aspect, which is on the labor supply side, the work from home part. Work from home, if you look at the work of Nick Bloom and others at Stanford, will tell you that is something that is extremely valued by the workers that can benefit from it. So it's not necessarily workers in client-facing industries, but it could be any one of us has been working from home for part of the time, even if we have moved past the pandemic. And workers value that so much that they're willing to give up some of their real wage. Nick Bloom's estimate of 5 to 8%. So that is one reason why maybe the real wages don't need to come up all the way, because in some part of the wage distribution, some of the workers are happier with, they're getting the amenities of work that are sufficiently better that they don't need to have the monetary compensation of work that is coming back to the same level. And so this is where we have to sort of think about where the labor market is going forward.
Okay. One more. Yes, please.
Thank you. Well, first, thanks for the good debate. But on the Eurozone, we probably all agree that the sources of the acceleration of price increases is different in the continent, in continental Europe than in the U.S. Tighter labor markets, supply shocks. Still, there is an imbalance between supply and demand. And talking to a friend of Draghi that repaired the laggard behavior of the ECB for QE, don't you think that we have a risk of having a laggard in ECB in the tightening needs if the imbalances persist? A lot of countries in Europe have index minimum wages. Some countries do. The propagation effect may be for the insiders, despite the higher levels of unemployment, a problem in terms of persistent inflation once it's triggered. And inflation in Europe has a variation between 6% and over 10% with a common central bank and not the flexibility of having in the US. Not only for Giavazzi, but Giavazzi is a privilege, has a privileged year of the former chief of the ECB.
I think the problem, as I see it in the Eurozone, is the fact that in the core country in Germany, wages have lagged on inflation. Even inflation was very low. So there is an accumulation, excess demand for an increase in real wages. Now that is happening on the wage negotiation. The issue is, like Rich was saying, is this a once and for all adjustment for what has been lost in the past, or will be the beginning of a change in the derivative in real wages? This is hard to say, but that's the thing to watch it. So far, in Germany, we're making up for lost real wages. If it stops at the level, it's fine. If it continues, it's not obvious. But the excess demand, I don't think it's still a problem.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. This is our last panel for today. The conference continues tomorrow at Columbia. And what a delight it is, again, to celebrate the great contributions and research accomplishments of Professor Calvo. Thank you so much. This last panel addresses the topic, quote, taming inflation. So we're going to be revisiting some of the issues that we just discussed. I'm Darrell Duffy at Stanford University. It's my pleasure to first introduce our panelists and then moderate the discussion following. Each panelist will have 10 minutes. So the same format as we just had. Our first speaker today is Jacob Frenkel. Dr. Frenkel is former governor of the Bank of Israel and currently chairs the G30 group. The Group of 30 is a group of leading international experts in monetary affairs. Jacob has had many leadership roles in the public and private sectors, for example, as chairman of JP Morgan International. And very relevant to our topic today, Dr. Frenkel is a central banker who has had some success in taming inflation in Israel in the 1990s. So I'm sure we're going to hear something about that. Our second speaker today is Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England from 2003 to 2013. And since 2013, Mervyn is a member of the House of Lords as the Baron of Loughbury. He's recently been the Alan Greenspan Professor of Economics and Professor of Law at New York University. Always outspoken, including on this topic, in a June 2021 Bloomberg essay, when core inflation was about 4%, Mervyn wrote, quote, "For the first time since the 1980s, two factors make inflation a serious risk: excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus and weak political resistance to the threat." Our last speaker, but not least, John Williams. Dr. Williams is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and in that capacity, he is also Vice Chair and a permanent member of the Federal Open Market Committee, which means that John is on the front line on our topic today, setting monetary policy and implementing monetary policy here at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. From 2011 to 2018, John was President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And John is, of course, widely known for his work in monetary economics. And at Stanford, we take great pride in bragging that he got his PhD right in our own economics department. So with that, Jacob, do you want to begin, please?
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here today, honoring a dear friend, Guillermo Calvo. I'm sure that we will have enough occasions to sing his praise, so I will not take in this session the time, except to say that I remember very well the time, and it was probably more than 35 years ago, when I was the economic counselor of the IMF, the great-great-grandfather of our speaker this morning, and I invited my very dear friend Guillermo to join, as I negotiated at the time with Jacques de la Rosière that he will give me budget for special academic advisors, and Guillermo was the first one. And I think that since then, we hit it off immensely. And At that stage, we were invited one time to visit what was then Czechoslovakia, and that's when I saw Guillermo in action. We went to a store, and we were instructed by our respective spouses not to come home without the crystals that Czechoslovakia was known for. And we went to the store, and the shelves were empty, literally empty. And Guillermo was really frustrated, and he asked the seller or the person who stood there, where is your merchandise? And the guy told him, well, I'll tell you, yesterday the Austrians came. And obviously the Austrians came and emptied the store, etc. And Guillermo came out and he told me, listen, we have a paper to write. What happened to the price mechanism? How come we need to see empty shelves before we put orders and we do this and etc., etc.? And we ended up writing 2 or 3 papers on the transition from previously centralized, central planned economy into quasi-market economy. So it was a delight, Guillermo, and since then we have been friends forever. What I will spend my time on is vignettes of several topics. First, the subject of the session today is taming inflation. Obviously, if we met 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we would have been looked at as astronauts. What do you mean? Is that the task, taming inflation? Where is the inflation? We need to raise inflation. And if we met 20 years ago, we would have had a very different framework. And yet, it's all monetary policy. And I think that if there is one thing that, and I've learned it a lot from Mervyn King's experience on inflation targeting, that when we talk about inflation targeting, we need to distinguish between inflation targeting in a country that has high inflation and wants to disinflate, and inflation targeting in a country that wants to maintain price stability. And it's a very different world. I think that it is fair to say that all the examples of inflation targeting that were used to lower inflation, nobody regretted to have done it. And those who, for maintenance, it's a very different world. And there is one issue that separates them. How do you correct when you miss something? So number one, we have learned that it's always important to have a band rather than a target number, because, you know, we don't know enough about the economy and we don't want to correct deviations in 1 year and all of these kind of things. And there are lags in policies, which is not the case when you have the price maintenance. It's a very different world. And I think that, however, the issue of disinflation is the place where insights from Guillermo's work comes in. Because there, what we need it for, it's typically starting in an economy that is completely dislocated. There is no, there are a lot of distortions, so you have to have transparency, you have to have accountability, you have to have credibility, all of the concepts that Guillermo was working on. And I must say, it served, at least in our case in Israel, it served us extremely well to stick by the inflation targets as the compass and as the gauge, because that's the way you communicate with the market. So that's item number one. When you are correcting it, there is an issue. As you disinflate, and you are starting somewhere high, and you have a long-term plan to arrive to price stability, and you miss your annual objective along the path, it makes a great difference, in my judgment, if you miss it from above or from below. If you exceed your objective and you have lowered inflation more than what you wanted, don't be upset so much about it. You are going in the right direction. If, however, you are missing in the other direction, then obviously you go in the wrong direction. So symmetry is not called for. Yet, when it comes to price stability maintenance, whatever way you define it, as 2% or whatever, there where symmetry comes in. And somewhere in between those considerations are relevant. My last remark about the inflation targets is about the frustration that we have had during the zero lower bound and the proposals that if you don't hit your target and you have difficulties, then why don't you move the target and then you will not miss it. Obviously, for all of us who were working so hard to get credibility from the very target itself, it is not a good idea. And I think that it really, of course, we all understand the logic of it because it allows you to operate with the zero lower bound and avoid it and all the rest. But I think that if you want to consider changing the target, do it after you have reached it and not when you are not at it. Let me go into another issue that I think really was an obstacle in the past few years in running monetary policy, which is we spent too much time, we means we central bankers, we spent too much time on arguing whether shocks are permanent or transitory, with the implications that if they are transitory, we don't need to do much about it. And if they are permanent, we should do something about it. And therefore, we are building into the system falling behind the curve, because by definition, you will fall behind the curve. And I think that this is posing the question of permanent versus transitory, and not that I'm not familiar with supply shocks and all of that, but yet posing the questions in these terms puts the problem on its head. Because it is the task of monetary policy to ensure that shocks that would become permanent are becoming transitory by the very policy action that is being taken. And that's where the credibility is being used and invested into it, etc. So I think that the issue of the permanent transitory was not very helpful, and it caused us to delay. Then the second concept that was ruling the day at the time was we are data dependent. Now, being data dependent in a trivial way, a non-sophisticated way, means we better not act until we see things in the data, which means, again, falling behind the curve by definition. Of course, we all know that what is really at point is we are expected data dependence. And if we are expected data dependence, then we are in a different world. We are in a world in which, of the star world of J. Powell, we are working on models, and there we have to put our focus on the models, and clearly models have led us astray, and we need to understand why and all the rest. What is clear is, because by definition the models are accumulating information from the past into projection for the future in one way or another, when the future is fundamentally and structurally different from the past, needless to say, the value of the models diminishes. And that's what we have had in the past few years quite a bit. Let me say one more word about QE. I'm not going to elaborate, but I want to say one word. QT is much more complicated than QE. And not because of the fact that raising interest rates is more difficult than lowering interest rates. That's a trivial statement. But rather, the liquidity that has been accumulated in the system during the QE and has impacted the financial, in the financial system all around, removing it, the QT part of it, that's where it's extremely complicated and in a way dangerous. My last remark, because I have one more minute, is how to correct the distortion given that we are falling behind. Given that one falls behind, how should you correct it? Slowly or quickly? And I would say think about a convoy. You are in a car and you are driving and you are falling behind. What do you do when you fall behind? You press on the gas, and for a time, you are riding, in fact, at a pace which is faster than the steady state because you want to make up for the distance that you lost before. And in our situation, it's even more, because if you are staying behind for too long, you are not only accumulating this equilibrium, you're also losing the credibility, which means you will need to build it up again by running faster. So the lesson for me is, if you find yourself falling behind, either in terms of interest rate or whatever, I would rather overshoot from above, raise it above what you would have, and gradually converge to the place where you want. And as you converge down, you lower interest rate, but at a slower pace than you lower the inflation rate, so that real interest rates remains high for a significant period of time. It's the only way to clean the system from the wrong expectations. And then you will ask me, what about the real economy? You are killing it. And that's where I say, what about structural policies? That's their domain. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to participate in this conference to celebrate Guillermo Calvo's contributions, and especially his famous 1978 paper. After the great inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s, a practical solution to the inconsistency problem about which Guillermo had written was to legislate for central bank independence in many countries around the world with a mandate to pursue price stability. And in many countries, this took the form, as Jacob has alluded to, of an explicit numerical target for inflation. And I think those targets proved remarkably successful until the past 2 years, when high and volatile inflation has returned to take central banks by surprise. So what's gone so badly wrong? Well, part of the answer is clearly a sharp rise in food and energy prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that isn't the whole story. Core CPI inflation is now between 5% and 6% in all three of the US, UK, and Euro area. And sticky wage inflation threatens to keep inflation above 2% for a while, but we don't know for how long. And I think central banks were slow to respond to the problem of rising inflation. So why did that happen? And I think my answer would be a misuse of the academic models of monetary policy, which people like Michael Woodford, who spoke earlier, developed. And people mistook the model for the world. People were setting policy in the model. Now, after a period of instability in the velocity of monetary aggregates, together with, I think, a very unfortunate focus by American monetarists on the monetary base rather than broad money, research went in the direction of trying to explain inflation without any reference to money at all. Instead, inflation was determined by expectations. As long as businesses and wage bargainers believed that inflation would stay close to 2%, then their behavior would ensure that inflation did indeed remain close to 2%. And expectations were at the heart of the work of two great Argentine economists, Guillermo Calvo and Diego Maradona, who in his spare time played football for Argentina. And in the 1986 World Cup, Maradona ran 60 yards from inside his own half, beat 5 English players before scoring one of the most remarkable goals ever in a World Cup. Now, the remarkable thing is that Maradona ran in a straight line. How can you beat 5 players by running in a straight line? Because the English defenders reacted to what they expected Maradona to do. Because they expected Maradona to move either left or right, interest rates going up or down, he was able to go straight on. And exactly the same applies to economic agents who react to what they expect the central bank to do. And this has been the basis of the modern analysis of monetary policy. But what determines these expectations? Now, if you don't have a model of the nominal variables driving inflation, an explicit transmission mechanism of monetary policy, it's actually impossible to define rational expectations of inflation. So how do you close the model? Well, the approach that was adopted was to assume that expectations were determined by the inflation target. In other words, people had complete faith in the ability of central banks to control inflation and bring it back to 2% after any shock. And such models have the property that by construction, any deviation of inflation from target is transitory, to use a word that we heard a lot about in 2021, but not a lot recently. In the early days of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England, we used to pore over forecasts for inflation produced by the bank staff for different paths of interest rates. And lo and behold, whichever path of interest rates we simulated, inflation always came back to target in the medium term. Why? Because the models said it had to. The medium-term path of inflation was determined by the inflation target. And recently, a member of the European Central Bank made exactly the same comment about the simulations that he had seen. Now, this is what I have called elsewhere the King-Canute theory of inflation. 1,000 years ago, King Canute of England was rightly worried that his supporters believed that he was omnipotent, and he wanted to disabuse them before some disaster occurred. So he took his throne to the seashore and commanded the incoming tide to halt. Now, of course, the incoming tide continued to rise and ultimately dashed over his feet and legs, driven by the laws of nature. See, he said, even I, a great king, cannot overrule the laws of nature by words alone. And central banks might do well to show the same humility. A satisfactory theory of inflation cannot take the form. Inflation will remain low because we say it will. It has to explain how changes in policy, changes in money, whether directly via QE or indirectly through changes in interest rates, affect the economy. And why would economic agents continue to trust central bank forecasts that inflation will shortly return to the 2% target when it turns out to have risen to over 10%? Now, obviously, for a long while, central banks were successful in keeping inflation close to the target, and so nothing disabused them of this very strong assumption that they were making until the pandemic came along. There was a sharp reduction in potential supply as a result of the measures taken to prevent the spread of COVID. Central banks around the industrialized world then decided to expand demand by a substantial program of money printing through quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is an expansion of the broad money supply, although most central banks seem to be reluctant to describe it as such. Unlike its use after the banking crisis of a decade or so ago, that which then was aimed at preventing a fall in broad money, contraction at a time when commercial balance sheets were contracting, this time, in the last couple of years, QE created a substantial monetary overhang, and broad money in the US grew at the fastest rate since the end of the Second World War. Aggregate money demand exceeded aggregate supply, valued at the current price level, augmented by the inflation target. The result was rising inflation. Now, the case for substantial monetary expansion in March 2020 was framed as a response to dysfunctional markets. But the monetary injection, even if that was appropriate, was not withdrawn once financial markets were operating normally. So then the argument was that the stimulus was justified in terms of supporting the economy. And the government did indeed need to support the economy, and it did so through generous unemployment compensation in the US and furlough schemes in Europe. But I would argue that additional QE wasn't really necessary. The lockdown response to COVID led to a large fall in potential supply, most of which was expected to be temporary. Demand was constrained by the inability to visit shops and restaurants and to travel. The actions taken to deal with the pandemic reduced the supply of goods and services. Central banks increased the supply of money, and this produced what was called 50 years ago the time-honored recipe for inflation: too much money chasing too few goods. Now, obviously, the story didn't end there, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine produced huge rises in the price of energy and food, especially in Europe, and headline inflation rose faster than core inflation. But I do think that getting away from this hidden assumption that in the long run inflation is bound to come back to the target is very important. Not easy to do in a model, which is why the models have made the assumption that inflation in the medium term is driven by the target, but in practice, when setting policy, it's important. Now, there is some good news here. The good news is that during 2022, central banks stopped printing money through QE and raised short-term interest rates. So now we are in a position where monetary growth and nominal demand are no longer expanding rapidly. And indeed, in the United States, broad money is actually declining. So in due course, that suggests that it's likely that headline inflation and core inflation will fall back. But how quickly is obviously unclear, because high wage inflation suggests that there may have been some de-anchoring of inflation expectations from the target, and past experience of bringing down expectations suggests that the process is painful and requires considerable slack in the labour market. I think the era of low inflation and corresponding low interest rates may well be over. There's no reason why central banks cannot bring inflation back to the 2% target. And unwittingly, monetary policy actions mean that high inflation rates of the past 2 years should prove, if I could use the word, transitory.
Well, good evening, everyone. I should add my welcome here to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and enjoying our wonderful conference facility, and hopefully a great start to the conference itself. I'll try to keep my remarks relatively short, because I think really maybe the most interesting part is yet to come with the questions and answers. But I'll just start from, I'll start with the disclaimer. Everything I say is my own views, not necessarily those of the FOMC or anybody else in the Federal Reserve System. I got that, okay. So the first remark I would make, and I think ties into Jacob's remarks and Mervin's and probably many others, is I do want to stress that, as Mervin said, having a explicit numerical inflation target is actually a very important part of a monetary policy strategy that we understand for the Federal Reserve that it is our responsibility to achieve and maintain price stability over time. This is not a goal that we're looking for someone else to solve. This is the goal that we need to solve as a central bank for the United States. And the 2% inflation is basically a foundational target for us to make sure that we achieve that over time, and that we maintain, and again, achieve and maintain price stability. Because of course, price stability is in fact the foundation of economic prosperity. Without price stability, all of the other goals that we have, whether maximum employment or low and stable or low interest rates, can't be accomplished. So that's an absolute imperative for us, and we all understand that. And the second thing I would say is we understand that, and I am speaking for myself, we understand that it's monetary policy that's going to achieve this return to 2% inflation. It isn't the magic of our models. I wish that were true, but it isn't. We understand that in order to achieve these goals, monetary policy has to take the actions that achieve the economic conditions that support that equilibrium of achieving price stability and 2% inflation. So I think I'll talk just very briefly about how I view how we're going to tame inflation, which we will do. We're absolutely committed to getting inflation back to 2% over the next few years. I think I do start from where we start, start from where the book starts. PCE price, personal consumption expenditures price index inflation over the past 30 years averaged almost exactly 2%. That's our definition of our longer run inflation target, and that's basically where we started when the pandemic hit, and that's where we have to get back to that. What we saw is about 2 years ago was a dramatic rise in inflation. Some of it due to the food and energy prices, but in the U.S., I think earlier than in other regions, clearly showing through to core or underlying measures of inflation. So we saw that in 21 and then obviously increasing in 22. We saw the PCE price index inflation reach all the way to 7% last year. It's now down to 5%, but still 5% is far too high, far above our 2% longer run goal, and clearly the number one monetary policy issue that we face. And thinking about how do we take these policy actions and bring economic conditions to bring us back to 2%. I do think it is helpful to break down where is the inflation today and what are the drivers of that. And I will not use the transitory or permanent or any of that other language, but really just talk about the sectors of the economy that clearly have been affected by the pandemic, have been affected by Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine, and have been affected by the fundamental imbalance between supply and demand in the economy. So in thinking about that, right now, if you look at pretty much any measure of underlying inflation in the U.S., it's running about 3.75%, again, on this PCE price index basis. We have the multivariate trend core here that our economists have developed. That's about 3.75% over the last 6 months. Core PCE inflation about the same. The Dallas Fed's trim mean all around 3.75%. And so that's taking out some of the higher frequency movements in some of the factors like energy prices and the like. So when you think about where inflation is and how we got to this place, I would say, first of all, I go back to my onion metaphor that I've used in a number of speeches. There's basically inflation is like an onion, it has multiple layers. The outer layers are the commodity prices like energy, food, lumber, steel, things like that, which were affected by the global economic conditions, obviously supply chain issues, and everything that's been happening. We saw a huge run-up in global commodity prices. We've seen many of those now have reversed. So those are one layer of the inflation story, but again, not the kind of underlying core part of the story right now. That's explains some of the volatility we saw in the last few years, but again, going forward, not the biggest driver. The second layer of the onion is really the durable goods or goods prices. And that's, I think, where you get the biggest kind of kick in the dynamics from the pandemic, from the supply chain issues, and from this extraordinary increase in demand for goods relative to available supply, again, affected by supply chain issues. And here we saw, record increases in used car prices, other goods prices happening in 21, 22. It was around that time that this word transitory was used because clearly used car prices aren't going to go up 10, 20, 30% every year forever. They have an equilibrium that they'll come back to over time. And we've seen that dynamic kick in. But again, it's there, I think a lot of that is related to some of the specifics around supply chain bottlenecks, very strong demand, and some special factors, and we've seen some of those already recede. I will say on the goods prices, although we're seeing goods prices come down over the last several months, there are some signs that this is not likely to, or some signs that this may not go as quickly as hoped. And one is we at the New York Fed have our global supply chain pressure index. That came down dramatically in 2022, but over the last several months has been relatively flat at a level of about 1 standard deviation above normal. So we still have significant supply chain issues in the global economy, so that's going to slow the ability of prices to come down on the goods side. Similarly, we're seeing very strong demand globally, with China clearly bouncing back, Europe's economy doing better, and other signs in the U.S. economy having resilience. So demand for goods is one factor that probably means that these prices aren't going to come down as fast as some people have predicted. But getting back to monetary policy, that's kind of the outer layers of the onion. It's really the inner layer that's the one that we need, I think, to be most focused on. That's the core services, if you will, the rest of the inflation. That's where we're seeing, again, this underlying inflation around 3.75%, excluding housing, and I'll talk a little bit about housing. So here is where we're seeing the clear signs that demand exceeds supply, similar to what we just heard. The signs that where monetary policy needs to play the role in bringing demand down, bringing our economy into better balance, and removing these inflationary pressures and bringing inflation back to 2%. And when you look at core services, if you look at the housing component, that's been one of the biggest drivers of inflation. In recent data, we now have data on new lease rents for newly signed lease contracts. Those numbers have come down quite a bit. So on the shelter cost or the rent side, there is definitely signs that a slowing economy, higher interest rates, and other factors have been bringing inflation down. But we still have this issue that we have core services excluding shelter. Inflation is high, and I go back to, I don't know if it's our models or econometric models or our theories or anything, but the basic diagnosis here is we have demand that exceeds supply in our economy. The labor market is extraordinarily strong based on pretty much any measure. Demand for goods and services exceeds supply. And the role, and in order to get inflation back to 2%, monetary policy needs to take the actions that brings demand and supply back into balance, restores the inflation back to 2%. I think one lesson from the past, we've learned a lot from the past in thinking about how do we make sure that we get kind of financial conditions and the stance of monetary policy right in order to get inflation back to 2%, goes back to basic issues of we have a very clear numerical inflation target that we're committed to, taking the actions to achieve that. We've managed to keep inflation expectations remarkably well anchored during a period of high and volatile inflation. If you look at longer run inflation expectations, they've stayed, whether on surveys or market-based, they've stayed remarkably stable around our goal. And even, again, I'm always touting the New York Fed research here, but even our own survey of consumer expectations, which did rise quite a bit during the run-up inflation, the 3-year ahead inflation expectations has fully reversed the rise since the beginning of January 2021. Short-run inflation expectations have come down quite a bit, and our longer-run measure has been stable. So what's the lesson to me on this? It's basically where I started. First of all, absolutely critical to be committed to a numerical inflation target, to anchor our decisions and anchor our communications around that strategy and around that target, obviously, and carry out the policies that will achieve that. One thing that I think will help us, and I think will help other central banks, is having that commitment. Having that strategy also means that inflation expectations are actually helping us. We can't take them as exogenous. We understand, we've talked about this a lot, that if we don't deliver the 2% inflation, inflation expectations will shift. But to the extent that we can do that, well-anchored inflation expectations help stabilize the economy. And the one thing we don't want to do is allow that anchor to slip because we know the cost of that from the past. So to my mind, this has been an incredibly complicated set of circumstances over the past few years on inflation. It's a global phenomenon, but it relates to the pandemic, it relates to the war, and many other factors. But at the end of the day, our job is clear. Our job is to make sure that we restore price stability, which is truly the foundation of a strong economy. Thank you.
Terrific. I'm going to take my prerogative and ask a question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. We've talked a lot about diagnosing how we got here and whether the drivers are. Our panel's topic is taming, and as Mervyn said, we need to actually do things. You've got multiple tools. I want to go back to what Jacob said about quantitative tightening and what Mervyn said about the use of the Fed's balance sheet or central bank balance sheets in March of 2020. And now we're going the other way. Balance sheets are going down. In his panel, Pierre-Olivier talked about what happened at the Bank of England when on September 22nd, the Monetary Policy Committee announced that the Bank of England would begin selling gilts, and the very next day, Prime Minister Truss's budget caused the Bank of England to go in the opposite direction. And on September 28th, the Financial Policy Committee, a different committee of the Bank of England, said that we're going to be buying gilts. So this presents the use of the balance sheet as a tool for taming inflation that's sometimes, as Jacob put it, tricky. I'd like to get your reactions, each of you, briefly to that. Mervyn, why don't you start? And then...
Okay. So I think this is not the moment to engage in a rapid reduction in the size of central bank balance sheets. Broad money is falling in the US, growing slowly in the other central banks. We've been, I think, overly obsessed by the problem of the zero lower bound. Obviously, we're above that now, but I think the focus on whatever tightening is to be done, I would focus on interest rates rather than the balance sheet. You mentioned the experience of the Bank of England in September. That illustrated well, I think, that the idea of using the same, what other people think of as the same instrument, and it is the same instrument for two very different purposes, is going to create confusion. The irony is that actually the bank has now moved to where it wanted to be, which is with a liquidity facility, which its own Financial Policy Committee recommended in 2018 and 2020. So that's the way to deal with those problems. And I think one of the things that's gone wrong with the use of QE, which has led to such large balance sheets, is that whenever some bad news comes along or something seems to go wrong, central banks say, gosh, we've got to do something. So we'll do QE. Even if what went wrong did not in and of itself justify a substantial monetary expansion. I mean, an example would be 2016, Bank of England did it in response to the result of the European referendum, when again, everyone said, whatever view you take, if anything, that's going to lead to a reduction in the supply potential of the economy. It's very odd to use that as a justification for boosting demand. But I would not want to focus too much now. And I think the other point I make on this is the problem that occurred in 2020 and 21, in my view, was that central banks didn't have a credible narrative to explain what they're doing. And as John showed in his remarks, the best way for central banks to tame inflation is to create a reputation for understanding the economy and taking people through a narrative that inevitably evolves over time. And you never focus on these crazy point forecasts for inflation, which journalists and financial market people seem to love. At least, when someone said, do you believe inflation's 3.2 or 4.8 a year from now? These are meaningless statements. What is not meaningless is talking about the risks to inflation, on the upside or the downside, where they come from. So I think what a central bank has to do is very much what John did in his remarks, which is to say, this is where we think the economy is, this is where we think the risks are. We can't pretend to forecast with any great accuracy at all. The world is highly uncertain. Who forecast the pandemic? Who forecast the invasion of Ukraine? No one in sufficient time. So you have to accept those things and then develop the narrative. But the narrative is the key thing, not relying on just numbers coming out of a forecast model.
Mm-hmm. John, Jacob?
Let Jacob go.
Okay. 2 points. Number one, I fully agree when we talk about the two channels through which monetary policy can affect the economy, interest rates and the quantitative tightening or easing. I already said, I think that on interest rates we are on safer ground, and I would adjust interest rates relatively fast to wherever I feel I need to be. When it comes to the quantitative tightening, that's much more involved because the amount that the relative size of the market and the amounts that are involved are so huge that the disruption can be much more profound, and there I will go much slower with a more kind of a gradual way and basically find my way. The second point is, note that we are talking about, you spoke about pandemic, you spoke about war, you spoke about this and that, and we only speak about monetary policy. Of course, we are in the right place to talk about monetary policy, but when we assess monetary policy success, failure, it's extremely important to know what was the background music. Was it in the context of budget that is out of line or not? Was it in the context of a flexible economy or not? Was it in the context of a competitive economy or not? Etc., etc. So I think that at least in terms of our analysis, we should have a systemic analysis, even though our tools are defined as monetary policy. So this is the second point. Then the third one is we are talking about stabilizing the inflation target or the price level so defined. And our guide, whether we are where we are or where we are not, is in terms of a specific index. For a long time, actually for more than a decade, we were told inflation is like chickenpox. It's been eradicated. And we even had theories. And one of the theory was large cheap merchandise coming from China, which is not relevant anymore, and some others. But one thing is important. What is not included in the price index that we measure is where did the money go? And it went to the asset market. And with zero interest rates, obviously, we had very significant appreciation of the value of real estate, stock markets, etc. And this was accepted in the analysis of what are the pressures in the economy, but this was not in the target inflation and headline discussion measured. In fact, it was viewed as good. That's the good news. Asset market goes up, we become richer, and we rely on it even to sustain demand. Whereas the warning that we are having fragility in financial markets because of the extremely low interest rates, this was not aired loud enough, I think.
John?
So when I think about the use of the balance sheet in terms of market functioning, I just go back to March of 2020 in this building and obviously around the world. If the U.S. Treasury market doesn't function, the global economy doesn't function. And so to me, it's not really a monetary policy kind of technical issue. It's more of an issue of does the economy actually work? And because the U.S. Treasury market is so central to the global markets, making sure that that's actually functioning here. I'm not talking about QE in the sense of monetary policy. And that was clearly where the focus was, because without that, all of these debates that we're having about the optimal setting of monetary policy, I think would be moot. And then you think about QE in terms of using the balance sheet to affect longer-term interest rates. Does that help or hinder the achievement of the goals? Obviously, is a separate type of thought process in spring of 2020, summer of 2020, fall of 2020. The two were both happening at the same time. And we had to deal with the market functioning issue that morphed obviously over time into very much focused on how do we get the stance of monetary policy right. When I think about the future, because you really, the question you asked and the question I think we're all asking ourselves is how do we make sure that we're using the tools that we have and using them effectively and not at counter purposes. I go back to a couple of things. One is obviously the hopes for reform in some of these financial markets. I think this gets to Jacob's point about having a resilient financial system more generally, but in terms of these core markets, whether money markets, treasury markets, the need for effective reform so these markets are robust and not fragile. The other, of course, is the things that we've done ourselves in terms of the standing repo facility and the FEMA repo facility to make sure that there are backstops in these markets. So when there are stresses in them, it can be captured through those mechanisms rather than using other tools. But again, I think that March 2020, I hope, is a once-in-a-lifetime experience in terms of the shock, the size of the shock, and the speed at which it started spilling over, way beyond the Treasury market into the adjacent more fixed income markets, money markets, and things like that. So that situation, I think, was unique, required a pretty specific approach to deal with that. I think in the end was successful. In thinking of the future, it's really about creating a more robust, resilient financial market infrastructure, Treasury markets, and also, I think importantly, having these standing facilities there as backstops.
Terrific. We have time for some questions. Yes, please. We have a microphone that, if you wouldn't mind just waiting for the microphone.
That's Bruce Cusp.
I'd like to make a brief comment and then a question. The comment is Mervyn's thought that we had a very misjudged view of how central banks control inflation in the past, that if you had anchored expectations at 2%, you would always control inflation. I think that obviously was a mistake, but I think there's a bias in this conversation and more generally to look at the last 2 years and say inflation got out of control, therefore monetary policy made a mistake. I sat in Professor Calvo's classroom in the early 1980s, and I learned that in the face of supply shocks, what central banks are supposed to do is manage to try to keep output as close to its normal path while not letting inflation expectations to get out of control, and allow for prices to go up and manage how much output has to go down based on maintaining control of inflation over the medium term. Today in the world, there's no country in which GDP is running above its pre-crisis level, pre-crisis path, to speak of. We have not seen central banks overheat economies. We've seen a huge dynamic of supply disruption, dislocations, and of course, inflation went up. And I take your point, Mervyn, very much that monetary aggregates have surged. The problem I have with that is in a world in which balance sheet policy has been super aggressive, interest rates are being controlled by the Fed, we only have one real observation to go on there. If we go back over the last 25 years, the relationship between money supply and inflation is extremely hard to put any weight on. And I think putting it in this context, I think is something I would have some issue with, looking at the way inflation has moved, where it's moved, how it's moved across countries. So just throwing that out, I think we should be humble about understanding the inflation in the last 2 years. And I think, broadly speaking, not losing sight of the fact that central banks were slow. You guys were slow, John, in terms of your response. We can all say that. But I don't think that's why inflation got out of control over the last 2 years. However, central banks may not have been responsible for what happened, but they're going to be super responsible for what does happen. And I guess the way I want to pose my question is, we've had almost 500 basis points of Fed tightening. We've had, in the advanced economies overall, almost 400 basis points of Fed tightening. How do we use our humility in terms of understanding transmission, our humility in understanding how the world has changed, to make decisions here? It's a little bit hard to say data dependence and then translate that into what to do now. And I'm obviously, John, you're on the lines on this, but I'm just wondering, in the people on this panel's view, having seen what the Fed's done, having thought about how we're getting transmission, what do they actually think should happen next in terms of what the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, other central banks should do?
It's a very broad question. Do you guys want to address that?
Let's have more questions.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take another question, because that was quite broad. Yes, Rich, please.
Rich Clarett, enjoyed the panel. Question for Mervyn and Jacob. I won't bring John into this. One of the things that I've noticed that has not gotten a lot of attention, but I'm sure future monetary historians will notice it, is with the possible exception of Switzerland, I don't think any major central bank, at least among the advanced economies, actually preemptively hiked rates before inflation got to target. In the case of the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Canadians, the Australians, those banks were all inflation targeters, and they all delayed the first rate hike until inflation had exceeded, in some cases for some time. So why do you think that was or is? More broadly, it's not just a U.S. issue. It was a collective G7, G8, whatever the Gs are now, decision to delay a rate hike until inflation had moved above the target, in some cases for some time.
Okay, who wants to address that?
Well, I'll come in on that. I think there was a common intellectual problem with thinking that, inflation has gone up a bit. But, this happens from time to time, and we're so confident that expectations are so well anchored to the official target that it will just go away. And part of this, I think, is if you read a lot of the literature on monetary policy, you'll see words like demand shocks and supply shocks. And I think this can be very unhelpful. What you have to do is what John did, which is tell us what is going on now. A narrative of what the true nature of the shock. And this comes back to the point you raised about 2020 and the pandemic. What was very clear was that the measures that were taken by governments were deliberately designed to reduce the level of output. Temporarily, but it was a deliberate intent to do that. And that's what the government wants to do. It seems very odd for another part of the policy-making machine to be trying to boost demand at the same time. That was my concern. I think this is related to Larry Summers' point. I would put it more in terms of the monetary response. He'd do it in fiscal response, saying that, the fiscal package boosted demand at a point when supply had fallen. And I think, therefore, the phrase demand and supply shock is helpful in an academic environment when you're trying to produce a model. But models are not descriptions of the world. They are deliberately simplified and abstract to give you some insight into a problem that you can then take away to the world and apply that insight to the world. And the narrative about what is actually going on is, I think, fundamentally important.
Okay, we have time. Oh, Jacob?
Yes. First of all, it's a profound observation and correct one. But my reading of it is that the jointness of approach or jointness of response or lack of response is not due to we sit together and we coordinate, but it is in a deeper way. We are using the same model or same perspective. And it's not because it is in the air, but because central banks, and one of the greatest things about central bankers is that they have so many frequent meetings in Basel and everything like this, so by osmosis, they end up converging, and converging for good or bad. So if they miss, we miss together, and if we choose 2% to be our target, suddenly it becomes the holy target that Jean-Claude Trichet always is so proud to say, we all chose the same target. Of course, you did not discuss it, but you sat in the same room, and that's the way things come up. But it's not necessarily criticism or anything, but it's an observation, always, of group dynamics. And it's true about politics, it's true about information. You are watching CNN, you have one view about the world. If you're lucky and you have another channel, you also have another view of the world. But I want to say something about Maradona, and I'll pick up on that issue because it is related. Not Maradona, but the expectation. I think that for a long time, we departed from William McChesney Martin, the long-standing, longest-serving chairman of the Fed, dictum that monetary policy need to be anticipatory. You remove the punch ball away before the party gets going. But how do you know that the party is going to happen before it happens? Because you have your own anticipatory machinery, either good or bad, what models you use or whatever, but it is anticipatory. And I think that for some time, we deviated from, not willingly, from the anticipatory one, because we had a framework that said inflation is passé for the list of reasons that was mentioned for a very long time, and we did not change it quickly enough to recognize that inflation was not passé. And when there was a supply shock that generated through the system, we called it transitory because it is a supply shock.
Good. We'll give John the last word because we're out of time.
One thing I just want to make clear, I mean, John Taylor is here, Professor Calvo is here, many other, leading lights of how we think about the economy, the global economy and monetary policy are here. I mean, I view that what central bankers, our main job is really the price stability. And, sure, we were focused a lot on low R star. I know that myself. We were focused on inflation running below the target. But I don't think there's any confusion about the absolute necessity of bringing inflation back down when it does rise. Sure, people didn't anticipate it correctly. They didn't foresee all the things that happened. But there's just absolutely no deviation from the need to get inflation back down. You need to have real interest rates above a neutral level, or however you want to frame that issue. So when I think about the mistakes of history going back, 100 years, there's no confusion about nominal and real interest rates, no confusion about who owns this goal and the absolute importance of it. So I'm sure the historians and many will go back and debate every action that took place. But I think the one thing that we've learned from the greatest thinkers and the past policymakers, that's going to really be our kind of secret sauce, if you will. The owning the inflation, getting it back down to 2%, and understanding what we need to do in order to achieve that.
Terrific last words. Thank you. Really well said.